Welcome to a journey into the darkest corners of human obsession, belief, and fear. Today, we explore 25 of the most disturbing cult stories in the United States. These tales are not mere fiction, they are based on real events that shook communities, claimed lives, and left lasting scars on the psyche of the nation. From infamous mass suicides to chilling manipulations of power and faith, the stories we share today reveal the terrifying lengths to which some groups will go in the name of devotion. In the 1970s, a sense of hope and social justice drew countless Americans to a religious movement that promised equality, community, and a better world. That movement was the People's Temple, led by the charismatic Jim Jones, whose vision of a utopian society masked a darker reality of manipulation, fear, and control. What began as a small church in Indiana and grew into a nationwide organization ultimately spiraled into one of the most horrifying tragedies in modern history. While the settlement known as Jonestown was located in the remote jungles of Guyana, its roots and repercussions were deeply entwined with the United States, leaving a lasting imprint on the national consciousness. Jim Jones was a man of immense charisma. His speeches, filled with promises of social equality and spiritual salvation, attracted a diverse following. People from different racial and economic backgrounds were drawn to his vision of a society where all were equal, where discrimination and poverty would be abolished. In California, the People's Temple thrived, attracting hundreds of followers who saw Jones as a leader, mentor, and even a father figure. He preached love and community, but behind the scenes, he cultivated an atmosphere of fear and surveillance. Followers were expected to devote their lives entirely to the temple, severing ties with friends and family outside the organization. The promise of utopia became a trap, as obedience to Jones was framed as the path to salvation. By the mid-1970s, Jones faced increasing scrutiny from the media, local authorities, and disillusioned former members. Accusations of abuse, financial impropriety, and intimidation threatened the stability of his movement. Seeking refuge and a controlled environment, Jones orchestrated the establishment of a settlement deep in the jungles of Guyana, a place where he could exert absolute control over his followers. This settlement, eventually known as Jonestown, became the physical manifestation of his vision and his tyranny. Life in Jonestown was grueling and oppressive. The remote location, combined with harsh living conditions, kept residents isolated from the outside world. Followers were subjected to constant labor, ideological indoctrination, and public punishments for perceived disobedience. Jones' speeches became increasingly apocalyptic, warning of imminent threats from the outside world and cultivating a siege mentality. The community was transformed into a controlled environment where dissent was dangerous and loyalty to Jones was the ultimate measure of worth. Fear and psychological manipulation were constant, as residents were taught to report each other's infractions, fostering mistrust and paranoia. The climax of Jonestown's story came on November 18, 1978, when the darkest aspects of Jones' control reached a horrifying conclusion. A delegation from the United States, including Congressman Leo Ryan, traveled to Guyana to investigate reports of abuse and human rights violations within the settlement. Initially welcomed, the visitors quickly became aware of the fear and tension that permeated the community. As Ryan and his party prepared to leave, they were ambushed at an airstrip by armed temple members, resulting in the deaths of Ryan and several others. Following the attack, Jones ordered the mass ingestion of a cyanide-laced drink among the residents of Jonestown. What began as a communal act of devotion quickly turned into a nightmare. Over 900 men, women, and children, many of them coerced, terrified, or unable to resist, died that day. The scene was a chilling tableau of blind obedience and despair, a devastating culmination of years of psychological manipulation and isolation. Parents were forced to watch their children die, and individuals who might have resisted were met with threats, intimidation, or immediate violence. The horror of Jonestown was total, leaving few survivors to recount the events. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Jonestown to occur remain the subject of study and reflection. Jones' combination of charisma, ideology, and coercion created a system in which critical thinking was suppressed and fear became a tool of control. The settlement's isolation amplified his influence, removing external checks and allowing paranoia to dictate the community's behavior. Followers were gradually conditioned to equate obedience with safety and dissent with death, illustrating how vulnerable human beings can be to manipulative authority when cut off from alternative perspectives. Jonestown's impact extended far beyond the jungles of Guyana. News of the tragedy sent shockwaves across the United States, forcing the nation to confront the terrifying potential of cult dynamics, psychological manipulation, and absolute power. Families were left grieving. Investigators were left questioning how such a large group of people could be led to such an extreme end, and the media broadcast the story as a stark warning. The event became a symbol of the dangers inherent in blind devotion to charismatic leaders, as well as the catastrophic consequences of isolation and fear-driven control. Survivors of Jonestown carry stories that are haunting reminders of the human cost of the tragedy. Their recollections speak of loyalty, terror, confusion, and profound loss. They describe the psychological tension, the pervasive fear, and the moments of despair leading up to the mass deaths. Some managed to escape through courage and quick thinking, while others were spared by circumstance. Yet all were forever changed by the horrors they witnessed. These personal accounts ensure that the events of Jonestown are not just a statistic, but a deeply human story of manipulation, suffering, and the loss of life on an almost unimaginable scale. Today, Jonestown stands as both a historical site and a cautionary tale. It reminds us that the promise of utopia can conceal oppression, that charismatic authority can override reason, and that human devotion can be weaponized in the service of power. The tragedy continues to be studied by psychologists, sociologists, and historians seeking to understand how such events unfold and how to prevent similar disasters in the future. It is a story that forces reflection on faith, authority, and the vulnerabilities of the human mind when confronted with manipulation and fear. In the late 1990s, a serene community in Rancho Santa Fe, California, became the center of one of the most shocking and unsettling events in American history. This tragedy revealed the terrifying power of manipulation, the extremes of ideological devotion, and how a distorted belief system can completely override the most basic human instincts for survival. Marshall Applewhite was an unusual figure, part spiritual teacher, part psychological manipulator, and wholly devoted to his vision of human transcendence. In the 1970s, he began attracting followers, promising them an escape from the limitations of the human body and an elevation to a higher plane of existence. Applewhite presented himself as a guide, someone who could lead his followers beyond earthly concerns and toward a form of cosmic enlightenment. His teachings were a fusion of religious concepts, New Age philosophies, and apocalyptic imagery, creating a belief system that was simultaneously complex, alluring, and isolating. Applewhite's control over his followers was meticulous and total. Members adhered to strict rules, ranging from diet and clothing to communication and interpersonal interaction. Individuality was suppressed in favor of the collective identity of the group, and personal attachments were discouraged if they conflicted with devotion to Applewhite's teachings. He employed psychological tactics to reinforce obedience, using fear, guilt, and promises of salvation to maintain control. The result was a group entirely dependent on their leader for purpose, guidance, and validation, effectively cutting them off from outside influences and critical thinking. The Heaven's Gate community lived with an almost monastic discipline. Followers abandoned careers, family, and societal ties to reside in remote houses, adopting identical dress codes and engaging in daily rituals of meditation, study, and work that reinforced the group's ideology. Technology and external media were often restricted or scrutinized, ensuring that Applewhite's worldview remained unchallenged. The sense of isolation, both physical and psychological, allowed him to shape the perception of reality for his followers, conditioning them to see the world through the lens of his teachings. In March 1997, the group's focus turned to the skies. The Hale-Bopp comet, a celestial body visible to millions, became central to Applewhite's apocalyptic vision. He convinced his followers that a spacecraft was trailing the comet and that their physical bodies were merely vessels holding their immortal spirits. The cult believed that death would allow them to leave their earthly forms and board the spacecraft, ascending to a higher level of existence. This belief was so deeply ingrained that members saw suicide not as an act of despair, but as a necessary step toward transcendence. The logistics of the mass suicide were carried out with chilling precision. Members prepared their living spaces with meticulous attention to detail, writing farewell letters, recording video messages, and arranging their bodies in an orderly fashion. Applewhite, who had been the architect of their beliefs, guided the sequence of events, instructing followers on how to administer the lethal combination of substances that would end their lives. The process was framed as a spiritual ritual, and the group approached it with a solemn dedication that blurred the lines between devotion and death. When authorities arrived at the Rancho Santa Fe compound, they were met with an eerie scene. 39 bodies, all dressed uniformly and arranged neatly, lay in orderly rows. Video recordings and written statements revealed that members had fully embraced their leader's vision to the end. The sheer organization and calm with which the act was carried out highlighted the depth of Applewhite's influence and the terrifying extent to which his followers had surrendered their autonomy. The tragedy shocked the nation, raising questions about the nature of belief, manipulation, and human vulnerability. Psychologists and sociologists have since examined Heaven's Gate as a case study in extreme cult behavior. Applewhite's ability to reshape reality, create a sense of purpose, and suppress dissent demonstrates the mechanisms through which charismatic leaders can control devoted followers. The group's strict rules, isolation, and shared rituals reinforced conformity and dependence, making it difficult for members to resist or question the ideology. This convergence of psychological pressure, religious fervor, and social isolation created an environment in which rational thought and self-preservation were subordinated to loyalty and faith. The story of Heaven's Gate is also a cautionary tale about the seductive power of utopian promises. Applewhite offered an escape from fear, uncertainty, and mortality, presenting a vision of cosmic significance and ultimate reward. For followers who felt marginalized, disillusioned, or spiritually adrift, the promise of transcendence was irresistible. Yet the pursuit of this ideal led to a devastating loss of life, illustrating how charismatic authority and ideological extremism can manipulate hope into tragedy. In the aftermath, Heaven's Gate left a lasting impression on the American psyche. Media coverage and public fascination focused on the eerie precision, the uniformity of the participants, and the surreal nature of their beliefs. Survivors from peripheral connections, family members, former followers, and researchers shared stories of devotion, isolation, and indoctrination, providing insight into the psychological mechanisms at work. The incident has since become a reference point in discussions of cults, mind control, and the extreme dangers of unchecked ideological influence. Ultimately, Heaven's Gate serves as a chilling reminder of the fine line between faith and fanaticism. The devotion of its members, shaped and directed by a single manipulative figure, culminated in an event that was both tragic and surreal. The Rancho Santa Fe incident reveals how belief, when distorted and amplified by isolation, fear, and charismatic authority, can override the most fundamental instincts for self-preservation. It is a story that continues to haunt, a testament to the vulnerabilities of the human mind and the extreme consequences of absolute obedience. In the quiet outskirts of Waco, Texas, a sprawling compound became the center of one of the most infamous confrontations between a religious sect and the federal government in American history. The Branch Davidians, led by the charismatic and controversial David Koresh, were a small, apocalyptic group whose beliefs and actions would ultimately culminate in a tragedy that shocked the nation. For 51 days in 1993, the world watched as negotiations, armed standoffs, and escalating tensions unfolded, culminating in a fiery siege that claimed the lives of 76 men, women, and children. The Waco incident remains a haunting example of the dangers of religious extremism, isolation, and the volatile intersection of faith and armed power. David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell, rose to prominence within the Branch Davidian secta, splinter group of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Charismatic, intelligent, and deeply persuasive, Koresh declared himself the final prophet, claiming to possess divine insight into the apocalypse and the end times. His teachings were apocalyptic in nature, emphasizing prophecies from the Bible, particularly the Book of Revelation, and asserting that only the devout who followed him could achieve salvation. Followers were drawn by a combination of spiritual conviction, personal loyalty, and the allure of belonging to an exclusive, prophetic community. The Branch Davidian compound, known as Mount Carmel, became both a sanctuary and a prison, isolated from the outside world. The compound allowed Koresh to exercise strict control over daily life. Members lived under rigid rules, with Koresh dictating personal behavior, relationships, and religious observances. The group maintained stockpiles of weapons and survival supplies, believing that an apocalyptic conflict was imminent and that they needed to be prepared to defend themselves against the forces of evil. This combination of ideological devotion and militarization created a volatile environment where fear and faith were intertwined. Tensions escalated in early 1993 when the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, attempted to investigate allegations that the Branch Davidians were illegally stockpiling firearms. The initial raid on February 28, 1993, quickly turned violent, resulting in a firefight that left 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians dead. The failed raid set the stage for the longest standoff in federal history, drawing the attention of the FBI, media, and the American public. Over the next 51 days, negotiators attempted to persuade Koresh to surrender peacefully, while Koresh and his followers fortified their compound and reinforced their beliefs in divine protection. Inside Mount Carmel, life continued under Koresh's authoritarian rule. Followers reported a strict daily routine, religious study, and preparation for the apocalypse. Koresh reinforced the narrative that they were under siege, interpreting the federal presence as proof of prophetic persecution. The psychological grip he maintained over the group was formidable. Members were conditioned to trust him implicitly, accept his interpretations of Scripture, and view outsiders as enemies. This combination of isolation, indoctrination, and fear created a situation in which reason and negotiation were increasingly difficult. As the standoff progressed, the media coverage amplified the drama, portraying Koresh as a dangerous cult leader and the Branch Davidians as potential terrorists. Negotiators sought to use persuasion and psychological tactics to encourage surrender. But the group's isolation and unwavering belief in Koresh's divine authority made compromise nearly impossible. The siege highlighted the challenges of handling armed, ideologically driven communities, particularly when they are cut off from external influences and deeply invested in apocalyptic worldviews. The tragedy reached its climax on April 19, 1993, when federal forces launched an assault on the compound using tear gas in an attempt to force a surrender. The situation rapidly spiraled out of control, and a massive fire engulfed Mount Carmel. Investigations into the cause of the fire remain contentious, with some attributing it to the actions of the Branch Davidians, and others suggesting external factors contributed. The scene was one of utter devastation, a chilling testament to the deadly consequences of extreme belief, armed isolation, and miscalculated intervention. The Waco tragedy left a profound mark on the American psyche. It raised questions about the limits of religious freedom, the role of government intervention, and the dangers of charismatic authority when combined with apocalyptic ideology. Psychologists and sociologists have studied the Branch Davidian standoff extensively, highlighting the mechanisms through which Koresh maintained control, including isolation, fear, and the manipulation of Scripture. The combination of intense loyalty, belief in imminent apocalypse, and preparation for violent confrontation created a perfect storm that ultimately led to mass death. Survivors of Mount Carmel recount a mixture of devotion, terror, and confusion. Many describe the psychological pressure to remain loyal, the belief in Koresh's divine mission, and the inability to imagine life outside the compound. Their stories provide a window into the intense social and spiritual control exerted within the Branch Davidian community, illustrating how ordinary individuals can be drawn into extraordinary circumstances and pushed to unimaginable extremes. The Waco incident has had lasting repercussions in law enforcement, religious studies, and popular culture. It has become a reference point for the handling of cults, the negotiation of armed standoffs, and the psychological dynamics of closed, ideologically extreme communities. The event also fueled debates over government overreach, civil liberties, and the balance between intervention and respect for religious freedom. For many, Waco serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of mixing religious extremism, armed isolation, and unyielding devotion to a single leader. Ultimately, the story of the Branch Davidians is one of faith gone awry, control exerted through fear and ideology, and the catastrophic consequences that can emerge when isolation and absolutism intersect. The deaths of 76 individuals stand as a grim reminder of the human cost of extremism, both in belief and in action. Waco is a stark lesson in the dangers of charismatic authority, the fragility of human reason under manipulation, and the tragic consequences when devotion turns into fatal obedience. In the summer of 1969, a wave of fear and horror swept across Los Angeles, leaving the nation shocked and questioning the nature of evil. At the center of this darkness was Charles Manson, a charismatic yet deeply disturbed figure who would orchestrate one of the most infamous series of murders in American history. The Manson family, as his devoted followers came to be known, were drawn not only to his magnetic personality, but also to the apocalyptic visions. He promised a vision that would ultimately culminate in murder, chaos, and a chilling reminder of the power of psychological manipulation. Charles Manson had spent much of his early life in and out of juvenile institutions and prisons, cultivating a deep understanding of human psychology, manipulation, and charisma. By the late 1960s, he had gathered a group of young, impressionable followers, many of whom were disillusioned with society and searching for meaning, love, and belonging. Manson presented himself as a spiritual guide, a prophet, and a symbol of rebellion against a corrupt world. He wove a tapestry of religious, musical, and social ideologies, blending concepts of race, apocalypse, and salvation into a framework that drew his followers into complete dependence on him. The Manson family's compound at Spahn Ranch became a world apart from reality, a microcosm where Manson's control was absolute. Members abandoned families, careers, and societal norms to live in this isolated community. Daily life was dictated by Manson's whims and teachings. He imposed strict rules, reinforced through both psychological pressure and sporadic violence, ensuring that the group remained loyal and obedient. The isolation and sense of purpose created a climate in which members were willing to act on Manson's increasingly erratic and violent directives, believing that their loyalty was a matter of survival and spiritual necessity. Manson's manipulation extended beyond mere authority. He skillfully exploited fear, love, and ideology. He convinced his followers that the world was on the brink of collapse, and that a race war he termed helter-skelter was imminent. According to his delusions, African Americans would rise up and dominate society, and only the Manson family could survive the chaos by committing acts of violence that would ignite the conflict. Manson's apocalyptic rhetoric, combined with his magnetic personality, created a psychological environment in which murder was reframed as a necessary, even righteous, act. In August 1969, Manson's vision took its horrifying shape. Using his followers as instruments, he orchestrated a series of brutal murders. The most infamous took place at the Los Angeles home of actress Sharon Tate and her guests. Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, and 4 others were murdered in a night of unimaginable brutality. The Manson family left behind cryptic messages written in blood, intended to shock and convey the apocalyptic nature of their crimes. Over the following days, Additional killings occurred at the home of Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, with similar brutality and ritualistic overtones. The acts were not impulsive but calculated, a manifestation of Manson's control and the extremity of his vision. The Manson murders highlighted the terrifying potential of psychological control. Manson's ability to bend the will of others, to instill a sense of inevitability and righteousness, demonstrates how charismatic manipulation can override moral and ethical instincts. His followers, many of them young and previously non-violent, became willing participants in acts of extreme violence. The murders were a direct reflection of Manson's delusions, yet they were executed with precision and obedience, underscoring the dangers of absolute authority and ideological fanaticism. Law enforcement eventually apprehended Manson and his followers, unraveling the shocking details of their crimes. During the trial, the public learned of the level of manipulation, control, and psychological coercion Manson exerted over his family. Witnesses recounted brainwashing techniques, isolation, and threats that kept followers compliant. The case became a defining moment in American legal and cultural history, illustrating not only the horror of the murders, but also the mechanisms through which individuals can be drawn into extreme, violent subcultures. The Manson family murders left an indelible mark on American society. Beyond the immediate horror, they sparked broader questions about youth culture, countercultural movements, and the vulnerabilities of the human mind to charismatic, malevolent leadership. The story of Manson and his followers became a cautionary tale, demonstrating how isolation, psychological manipulation, and ideological obsession can combine to produce devastating outcomes. Researchers and psychologists have since studied the events extensively, analyzing Manson's methods, the susceptibility of his followers, and the social conditions that allowed such a group to flourish. Survivors and former associates of the Manson family describe a mixture of fear, loyalty, and confusion, recounting the ways in which Manson's influence infiltrated their thoughts and decisions. Many expressed regret and trauma that lasted decades, reflecting the long-term impact of psychological domination and criminal manipulation. The narrative of the Manson family is not just one of murder, but also of coercion, deception, and the perversion of trust and devotion. Ultimately, the Manson family story is a chilling exploration of human vulnerability, charisma, and the extremes of belief. It shows how a single manipulative figure can reshape reality, bend morality, and convince others to commit acts that defy comprehension. The legacy of Charles Manson is a dark reminder that the human mind, when subjected to intense psychological pressure and ideological indoctrination, can be compelled to acts of unimaginable horror. In the arid deserts of the American Southwest, spanning across the borders of Texas and Arizona, lies one of the most secretive and disturbing religious communities in modern American history, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or FLD. For decades, this insular sect hid behind walls of faith and obedience, following the word of one man they believed to be God's chosen prophet on earth, Warren Jeffs. Under his rule, the FLDS community became a world unto itself, where absolute devotion was demanded, individuality was erased, and obedience often came at the cost of innocence. The FLDS broke away from mainstream Mormonism in the early 20th century, after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints officially renounced polygamy. Those who refused to abandon the practice retreated into remote desert enclaves, determined to preserve what they believed to be the true teachings of their faith. For decades, the FLDS operated quietly, practicing plural marriage and maintaining rigid hierarchies based on prophecy and priesthood authority. But when Warren Jeffs assumed leadership in the 1990s, the community's secrecy turned into something darker, a regime of control, fear, and abuse. Jeffs inherited leadership from his father, Rulon Jeffs, and quickly established himself not just as a prophet, but as a divine authority. He claimed direct communication with God, and his word became law. The community's isolated towns, particularly Short Creek, straddling the Arizona-Utah border, and later the yearning for Zion Ranch in Texas, functioned almost like small theocracies. Men were judged by their loyalty to Jeffs, women were expected to submit completely, and children were raised to follow without question. Polygamy was not simply tolerated, it was sacred. Jeffs arranged marriages according to what he called revelations from God. Young girls, some barely in their teens, were forced into unions with much older men, often relatives or high-ranking members of the church. They were told these marriages were necessary for salvation. Refusal was unthinkable. To defy the prophet meant eternal damnation. Women who spoke out were punished, banished, or had their children taken from them. Men who fell out of favor were exiled, often leaving behind wives and children, their families reassigned to more worthy followers. Behind the tall fences and guarded gates of the yearning for Zion Ranch in El Dorado, Texas, Jeffs built his empire. It was both a religious compound and a fortress of control. The sprawling property included massive homes, temples, and dormitories where hundreds lived under the ever-watchful eyes of church enforcers. Daily life revolved around strict dress codes, endless prayer, and unwavering obedience. Education was limited, cut off from the outside world. Television, radio, and the internet were banned. Everything from food rations to clothing was dictated by the prophet's word. But Jeff's control extended beyond the physical. He demanded spiritual purity and used this demand to justify horrific abuses. He convinced followers that only he could choose who entered heaven, using this power to manipulate every aspect of their lives. In private, Jeffs recorded audio diaries and spiritual teachings that revealed disturbing practices, including child exploitation under the guise of religious ceremony. In 2006, Jeffs was finally captured after being placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. His arrest and subsequent trials exposed the hidden world of the FLDS to the public. Investigators uncovered thousands of documents, recordings, and photographs that confirmed years of coercion, forced marriages, and systematic abuse. In 2011, Jeffs was convicted of sexually assaulting 2 underage girls he claimed were his spiritual wives and sentenced to life in prison. Even after his imprisonment, many in the FLDS community continued to view him as a prophet, sending him letters, tithes, and prayers. His sermons, recorded from prison, were distributed among the faithful, keeping his influence alive. Yet cracks began to form in the community's foundation. Survivors who escaped began to speak out, shedding light on the trauma and control they endured. Their stories revealed a life where free will was forbidden and love was replaced by fear. Today, the FLDS community still exists, though fractured and diminished. Some former followers struggle to rebuild their lives outside the only world they've ever known, while others remain fiercely loyal to Jeffs despite his crimes. The physical compounds may appear quiet, but the echoes of control, faith, and fear linger in every abandoned home and chapel. In the shadowy world of secret societies and apocalyptic cults, few groups were as chilling as the Order of the Solar Temple, founded in the 1980s by Joseph D. Mambro and Luc Jarret in Switzerland and France. The cult combined esoteric mysticism, apocalyptic prophecy, and claims of spiritual transcendence. While its core operations were in Europe, the Solar Temple also cultivated followers in the United States, creating a disturbing transatlantic web of devotion, secrecy, and ultimately, death. The U.S. connections reveal how a small, charismatic leadership can inspire blind loyalty, even across borders, leading ordinary people to participate in acts that defy logic and morality. Joseph D. Mambro was the mastermind behind the Order's ideology. A wealthy Swiss financier, he claimed a mystical lineage tracing back to the Knights Templar. Luc Jarret, a Belgian-born physician, was the public face, the charismatic preacher who drew followers in with promises of enlightenment and spiritual power. Together, they crafted a belief system that merged Templar symbolism, New Age philosophy, and Christian mysticism. Central to their teachings was the idea that the world was corrupt, humanity doomed, and that only through ritual purification and total obedience could one ascend to a higher plane of existence. By the late 1980s, the Order had begun reaching across borders. American followers were drawn from spiritual seekers, esoteric enthusiasts, and those fascinated by secret societies. Meetings, correspondence, and financial contributions connected these U.S. adherents to the European headquarters. Some Americans even traveled to Europe to participate in ceremonies, becoming part of an inner circle that practiced ritual meditation, chanting, and strict obedience. The allure was powerful. Followers were promised eternal life, a cosmic role in the salvation of humanity, and the thrill of belonging to a secret order few could access. As the 1990s approached, the cult's practices took a darker turn. DiMambro and Jarrett began preparing for what they called transit, the final passage of the faithful from the earthly plane to the stars. Members were told that death was not an end but a sacred transformation, a way to join higher beings and escape a corrupt world. The rituals leading to these deaths were meticulously planned. Followers were instructed to dress in ceremonial robes, arrange their bodies in symbolic patterns, and accept their fate with calm and devotion. In Switzerland and Canada, these plans culminated in a series of shocking mass deaths. Dozens of members died in orchestrated suicides and murders, sometimes shot or suffocated before buildings were set ablaze. Scenes of horror were reported, bodies arranged in ritualistic formations, ceremonial symbols surrounding them, and fires consuming their sanctuaries. The acts were framed by the cult as spiritual ascension, but for the outside world, they were a terrifying demonstration of manipulation, control, and fanaticism. The American links, though less lethal on U.S. soil, were significant. Followers in the United States provided financial support, facilitated recruitment, and sometimes participated directly in ceremonies abroad. Some American members were aware of the European deaths in advance, raising disturbing questions about complicity and moral surrender to charismatic authority. Even without bloodshed in the United States, these connections demonstrate how cult influence can transcend geography, ensnaring individuals far from the epicenter of violence. Investigators later noted that the Order of the Solar Temple exemplified the psychological mechanisms of extreme cults: isolation, control of information, manipulation of fear and hope, and the promise of transcendence to justify obedience. Ordinary individuals became willing participants in acts they might otherwise have found unthinkable, seduced by the idea of a higher cosmic purpose. In the U.S., the cult's presence remained mostly hidden. Yet its impact was real, feeding the fantasy and devotion that fueled the tragedies in Europe. Today, the Order of the Solar Temple is remembered as a grim example of apocalyptic cultism, with a shadow that stretched far beyond its European strongholds. Its US connections serve as a reminder that charismatic leaders can exploit spiritual yearning across borders, creating networks of devotion that can lead to destruction, even thousands of miles from the original headquarters. The story of the Solar Temple remains a chilling lesson in the dangers of blind faith, secretive authority, and the human desire for transcendence, a desire that, when manipulated, can become lethal. In the turbulent years of the late 1960s, amid the counterculture revolution sweeping across California, a movement was born that promised peace, love, and spiritual liberation, calling themselves the Children of God. This group began as a seemingly harmless religious commune led by a charismatic preacher named David Berg. What began as an idealistic Christian mission quickly spiraled into one of the most notorious and disturbing cults in modern history, later rebranding itself as the Family International. Behind the smiling faces, guitars, and spiritual slogans, the Children of God concealed a nightmare of manipulation, exploitation, and abuse that would scar generations of followers. David Berg, who later referred to himself as Moses David, presented himself as a prophet chosen by God to lead humanity into a new spiritual age. Preaching during a time of social upheaval, he attracted young people who had grown disillusioned with war, materialism, and organized religion. The group's early message was simple: reject the corrupt world and dedicate your life to spreading God's love. Members were urged to leave their families, sell their possessions, and follow Berg's vision of communal living. At first glance, it seemed like a revival of 1960s idealism, a return to faith, simplicity, and unity. But beneath this surface of spiritual freedom was a sinister structure of control. Berg's teachings evolved rapidly, twisting traditional Christian concepts into something dark and self-serving. He claimed to receive divine revelations directly from God, publishing them in writings known as the Mo letters. Through these letters, Berg exerted total authority over his followers, dictating everything from their relationships to their most private thoughts. He introduced bizarre doctrines that encouraged the destruction of personal boundaries, the rejection of conventional morality, and the elevation of pleasure as a form of worship. His word became law, and any questioning of it was seen as rebellion against God himself. As the group expanded globally, its internal rules became increasingly disturbing. Berg preached that sexuality was a gift from God and should be shared freely among members, including children. Under his guidance, the children of God blurred every line of morality and legality. Adults were encouraged to engage in sexual acts with minors as a supposed expression of divine love. Members were told that these acts were not sins, but sacred forms of affection that brought them closer to God. Those who hesitated or objected were accused of lacking faith, threatened with expulsion, or shamed into compliance. One of the cult's most infamous practices was called flirty fishing, beginning in the late 1970s. Female members were instructed to use sex as a means of recruitment and financial support. Berg claimed that by offering God's love through physical intimacy, women could win new converts to the faith. Thousands of women were coerced into this practice, traveling across the world to seduce potential followers. It was spiritual prostitution masked as evangelism, and it left countless victims emotionally and physically scarred. Life inside the communes was tightly controlled. Members were isolated from the outside world, discouraged from education or employment outside the group, and forbidden from consuming media that contradicted Berg's teachings. Children were often separated from their parents and raised communally under strict indoctrination. They were taught to worship Berg as a divine leader and to obey without question. Corporal punishment, humiliation, and forced confessions were common tools of discipline. The result was a generation raised in captivity, children who knew nothing of the world beyond the cult, offenses, and doctrines. By the 1980s and 1990s, reports of abuse began to surface as former members escaped and spoke out. Survivors described horrific acts of sexual exploitation, psychological manipulation, and physical cruelty carried out under the guise of spiritual enlightenment. Some had been abused from early childhood, forced into acts they didn't understand, told that it was God's will. Others recounted the trauma of separation, hunger, and fear, growing up in an environment where individuality was crushed and every decision was dictated by divine command. As public scrutiny intensified, authorities in several countries launched investigations into the cult's practices. The group responded by rebranding itself as the Family in 1978 and later, the Family International. Leadership publicly renounced Berg's more extreme teachings, claiming to have banned sexual contact between adults and minors. But for many survivors, these reforms came far too late. The damage had already been done, lives shattered, childhoods stolen, and faith twisted into a weapon. David Berg went into hiding in the 1980s, continuing to communicate with followers through letters and tapes until his death in 1994. Even after his passing, his writings remained central to the cult's identity, keeping his influence alive. His successor and spiritual partner, Karen Zierby, continued to lead the movement, further refining its public image while maintaining strict internal control. By the early 2000s, the Family International claimed to have moved away from its past, presenting itself as a benign Christian organization focused on missionary work and community outreach. Yet, for those who had lived through its darkest years, the scars never faded. Many former members have since spoken publicly about their experiences, forming support networks for survivors and seeking justice. Documentaries, books, and interviews have exposed the horrifying reality behind the cult's facade of love and faith. Survivors often describe the challenge of rebuilding their identities after years of manipulation, struggling to reconcile the promises of salvation with the trauma of exploitation. Some still bear the psychological wounds of their upbringing, nightmares, guilt, and the haunting sense of betrayal by the very faith they were born into. The story of the Children of God stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how charismatic leadership and distorted ideology can corrupt even the most sacred human impulses. What began as a movement for spiritual freedom evolved into a machinery of abuse, driven by a man who claimed to speak for God. Its legacy is not one of love or enlightenment, but of broken families, silenced innocence, and the dark truth that devotion, when twisted by power, can destroy everything it touches. In the turbulent atmosphere of the 1960s, when America was swept by waves of rebellion, experimentation, and spiritual seeking, a strange sect began to emerge from the shadows, the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Its members, dressed in flowing black cloaks and silver crosses, spoke of unity between Christ and Satan, love and destruction, and the coming apocalypse. To many, they seemed like a living embodiment of evil, a cult that blurred the lines between religion and the occult. While their roots began in London, their mysterious presence spread to the United States, especially in Arizona, where their rituals and eerie beliefs sent ripples of fear through the communities of Phoenix. The Process Church was founded by two British ex-Scientologists, Robert D. Grimston, born Robert Moore, and Mary Ann MacLean. The pair met in London during their involvement with L. Ron Hubbard's Church of Scientology, but they eventually broke away in 1963, forming their own movement that promised to guide humanity toward spiritual evolution. They called it the Process, symbolizing the journey of purification and enlightenment through chaos, pain, and revelation. Robert was the visionary preacher with sharp features and piercing eyes that gave him an air of authority. Mary Ann, the strategist, was even more commanding, a woman described by many as the true power behind the movement. Together, they built a theology that merged Christian imagery with darker, esoteric ideas. They taught that God, Satan, Lucifer, and Jehovah were not separate entities but aspects of one divine being. Humanity, they claimed, was caught in the eternal struggle between these forces, and only through embracing them all could salvation be achieved. Their message was both seductive and terrifying. It spoke to a generation disillusioned with organized religion, political corruption, and social chaos. The Process offered meaning amid the madness, a new spiritual order that promised both love and destruction. Members were told that the world was heading toward an inevitable apocalypse, and only the chosen few, those initiated into the process, would transcend into a higher existence after the final judgment. When the movement expanded to the United States, it found fertile ground in the counterculture hubs of New Orleans, New York, and especially Phoenix, Arizona. By the late 1960s, the Process Church had established a headquarters there, attracting followers who were drawn to its mystique and intensity. Clad in black robes, members walked the streets in small groups, handing out their magazine, The Process, which featured provocative essays on faith, sin, and redemption, often accompanied by images of skulls, flames, and apocalyptic symbolism. To outsiders, they looked like agents of darkness. Locals in Phoenix began whispering about their rituals, late-night gatherings filled with chanting, candles, and animal sacrifices. Rumors spread that the group worshipped Satan and practiced black magic. Some residents claimed to hear unsettling music and rhythmic drumming echoing from their compound in the desert. While these claims were often exaggerated, they reflected the unease the cult inspired wherever it appeared. The group's theology didn't help dispel fear. The Process taught that Christ represented love, Jehovah represented law, Lucifer represented enlightenment, and Satan represented destruction. Each was to be revered, not rejected. Their doctrine of reconciliation of opposites meant that even evil had a divine purpose. This idea horrified traditional Christians, who viewed it as blasphemy. In a time when the public was already anxious about occult influences, the Process Church became a perfect target for suspicion and dread. Their Arizona base became the center of many myths. Locals reported seeing strange symbols painted on rocks and hearing about initiation ceremonies held in the desert at night. Some believed the group was preparing for the end of the world, stockpiling food and supplies in underground bunkers. Others whispered that they were connected to high-profile crimes, including the later killings by Charles Manson's family. While there was no proven link, Manson's reported fascination with apocalyptic teachings made the rumor difficult to shake. The Process Church's public image grew darker when journalists began associating them with satanic ritual abuse, animal mutilations, and serial killings. Publications like the Saturday Evening Post and the Los Angeles Times painted them as a cult of chaos and death. The group's response was cryptic. They neither confirmed nor fully denied their beliefs, insisting that the media had distorted their message. But their deliberate mystery only deepened public fear. Inside the group, life was highly structured. Members surrendered their possessions and identities, adopting new names that reflected their spiritual roles. They lived communally, followed strict rules, and viewed Robert and Mary Ann as divine messengers. Absolute loyalty was demanded. The hierarchy within the process was rigid, and dissent was not tolerated. Members spent hours in meditation and confession, exploring their inner demons under the belief that only by confronting darkness could they achieve enlightenment. By the early 1970s, law enforcement and media scrutiny had taken its toll. The group's operations in Arizona and other U.S. cities began to falter. Accusations of brainwashing, financial exploitation, and occult activities drove many members away. The internal relationship between Robert and Mary Ann also deteriorated, and their separation in 1974 marked the effective end of the original Process Church. Yet, the story didn't end there. After its collapse, remnants of the movement splintered into new organizations. Some members rebranded the church as the Foundation Church of the Millennium and later as the Best Friends. Animal Society, headquartered in Kanab, Utah, the same group that would go on to run one of America's largest and most respected animal sanctuaries. The irony was striking. A movement once accused of satanic rituals had transformed into a symbol of compassion and rescue. Still, the legend of the Process Church refused to die. Its dark imagery and apocalyptic teachings continued to fascinate writers, filmmakers, and conspiracy theorists. Some investigators linked its symbols to later cult crimes, including the Son of Sam murders, though such connections remain speculative. In Phoenix and across the American Southwest, old rumors persist of hidden manuscripts, lost communes, and followers who never truly disbanded. The Process Church of the Final Judgment remains one of the most enigmatic cults in American history, a chilling reflection of the era's obsession with spiritual rebellion and the thin line between enlightenment and madness. Its shadow lingers in the desert air of Arizona, where whispers of its rituals and prophecies still echo among the dunes. A reminder of how easily the pursuit of divine truth can descend into darkness. In the quiet, high desert of Wasco County, Oregon, a strange new city began to rise in the early 1980s, a city of red-robed followers, lavish Rolls-Royces, and an intoxicating promise of spiritual freedom. It was called Rajneeshpuram, a commune built by disciples of the Indian spiritual leader Bhagwan Sri Rajneeshpuram, who would later be known to the world as Osho. What began as a dream of utopia, a place for meditation, love, and enlightenment, spiraled into one of the most disturbing and controversial chapters in American history. By its end, the commune would be infamous for corruption, manipulation, and even an act of domestic bioterrorism that stunned the nation. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh rose to fame in India during the 1970s, a charismatic and provocative guru. He preached a philosophy that blended Eastern mysticism with Western materialism. He spoke openly about sex, wealth, and freedom, subjects that scandalized traditional spiritual communities, but attracted a devoted international following. His teachings rejected asceticism, instead encouraging indulgence as a path to enlightenment. Thousands flocked to his ashram in Pune, India, seeking liberation from guilt, repression, and conformity. But by the early 1980s, the Indian government had begun to crack down on Rajneesh's growing influence. Facing mounting pressure, His chief lieutenant, a fierce and ambitious woman named Ma Anan, Sheila, began scouting for a new home for the movement. She found it in the vast, empty lands of Oregon's high desert, where she envisioned a new city, a self-sustaining paradise where followers could build the world of their dreams. In 1981, the Rognishas purchased a 64,000-acre Big Muddy Ranch near the tiny town of Antelope, Oregon. There, amid dry plains and rolling hills, they set about transforming the landscape into Rajneeshpuram, a massive commune complete with homes, meditation halls, farmland, a dam, an airport, and even a police force. It was a staggering accomplishment, built in just a few short years. At its height, Rajneeshpuram was home to over 7,000 residents, dressed in shades of red, orange, and maroon. They worked long hours to maintain the commune, meditated in mass gatherings, and attended nightly lectures by their beloved Bhagwan. Rajneesh himself lived in isolation, surrounded by luxury. His collection of more than 90 Rolls Royces gleaming under the Oregon sun. For his followers, he was a living god, the embodiment of truth and divine love. But outside the commune, fear and resentment grew. The residents of nearby Antelope, a town of fewer than 50 people, watched in disbelief as thousands of strangers flooded their once quiet valley. The Rajneeshas bought local businesses, took over government offices through elections, and renamed the town Rajneesh. Tensions between the commune and the local population escalated quickly. To outsiders, the movement seemed less like a spiritual community and more like a cult with political ambitions. Inside the commune, power had shifted dramatically. As the Bhagwan withdrew from public speaking, Ma'anan Sheila became his voice and his enforcer. Small, sharp-tongued, and utterly devoted to her guru, Sheila ruled Rajneeshpuram with an iron will. She demanded absolute obedience, silenced dissenters, and maintained strict control over every aspect of commune life. Surveillance cameras watched residents. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Those who questioned her authority were ostracized, expelled, or worse. By 1984, paranoia had begun to consume the leadership. Sheila and her inner circle believed that local and state authorities were conspiring to destroy the commune. The Rognishas sought to secure political control of Wasco County by registering thousands of homeless people from across the country to vote in upcoming local elections. When that plan failed, Sheila devised a far darker strategy, one that would forever stain the name of Rajneeshpuram. In the summer of 1984, Sheila and several of her closest followers launched a secret biological attack on the nearby town of the Dalles. Their goal was simple but chilling: to incapacitate local voters so they couldn't participate in the county election. To do this, they cultivated salmonella bacteria in a secret lab inside the commune. They spread the bacteria on salad bars at 10 restaurants around town. Over 750 people fell violently ill, suffering severe food poisoning. Though no one died, the event marked the first confirmed bioterror attack in U.S. history. At the time, investigators had no idea who was responsible. The truth would not emerge until the following year, when Sheila fled the commune amid growing tension with the Bhagwan himself. As cracks formed within Rajneeshpuram, the guru broke his silence. In 1985, he publicly denounced Sheila, accusing her of crimes including wiretapping, poisoning, and attempted murder. Sheila was later arrested in Germany and extradited to the United States, where she served time in prison for her role in the salmonella attack and other offenses. The downfall of Rajneeshpuram was swift and dramatic. Federal authorities raided the commune, uncovering evidence of wiretapping, stockpiled weapons, and detailed plans for future attacks. The Bhagwan himself was arrested on charges of immigration fraud and deported from the country in 1985. His followers scattered, and the once thriving city was abandoned, left to crumble in the Oregon desert. The site of Rajneeshpuram became a symbol of how idealism can mutate into extremism under the weight of power and control. What began as a vision of peace and spiritual liberation devolved into manipulation, paranoia, and criminality. The commune's residents, many of whom had arrived seeking enlightenment, found themselves trapped in a web of fear and obedience. Decades later, the story of Rajneeshpuram continues to fascinate and disturb. The empty ranch stands as a ghost of ambition gone awry, its ruins whispering of devotion turned to obsession. The tale of Bhagwan and Sheila remains a haunting reminder of how charisma can blind reason, how faith can be twisted into fanaticism, and how even the pursuit of spiritual freedom can become a prison. In the late 1980s, Japan witnessed the rise of a cult that would become infamous worldwide for its apocalyptic vision and acts of terror. Om Shinrikyo, founded by Shoko Asahara, a blind spiritual leader with claims of supernatural abilities. The group blended elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christian prophecy, and doomsday ideology into a dangerous, insular belief system. While Om Shinrikyo's most notorious actions occurred in Japan, including the 1995 Tokyo subway sarin gas attack, the cult's influence extended far beyond its homeland. It cultivated a small but devoted following in the United States, exposing the global reach of modern extremist movements and illustrating how apocalyptic ideology can cross oceans and cultures. Shoko Asahara, born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955, began his rise to prominence through a combination of charisma, mystical claims, and an appeal to spiritual seekers disillusioned with society. By the mid-1980s, he had established Om Shinrikyo, literally supreme truth, attracting followers with promises of enlightenment, psychic powers, and salvation from the imminent apocalypse. Asahara positioned himself as a messianic figure, claiming he could cure disease, predict disasters, and even grant immortality. His charisma was magnetic. Young men and women, many highly educated, were drawn into his orbit, abandoning their previous lives in pursuit of spiritual truth. The sect's teachings were a bizarre fusion of esoteric religion and doomsday prophecy. Members were taught that the world would soon descend into chaos, culminating in nuclear war and widespread destruction. Only the enlightened few who followed Asahara would survive and inherit a purified earth. This ideology justified increasingly extreme behaviors, from stockpiling weapons to secret chemical experiments. The line between spirituality and fanaticism blurred, as followers were instructed to sacrifice morality, personal freedom, and even life itself in service to the cause. While the majority of Om Shinrikyo's operations were concentrated in Japan, the group actively sought international outreach. In the United States, the cult established small centers and recruited students, yoga practitioners, and spiritual seekers. California, with its thriving New Age and alternative spiritual communities, became a particularly fertile ground for OM recruitment. Followers attended meditation classes, lectures, and seminars, unaware of the extent of the organization's secretive and militant agenda. Some were drawn by promises of psychic power or enlightenment. Others were enticed by the sense of belonging to a global, spiritually advanced society. American adherents often served as financial and logistical support, funneling money to the Japanese headquarters, translating Asahara's writings, or helping organize workshops and recruitment events. While most U.S. members were never directly involved in violent acts, their commitment reinforced the cult's global infrastructure. Investigators later discovered that Asahara maintained extensive correspondence with overseas followers, carefully grooming them to internalize his apocalyptic vision and maintain loyalty even across continents. The cult's methods of control were strikingly systematic. Members were isolated from outside influence, discouraged from questioning Asahara, and indoctrinated through a combination of meditation, ritual, and psychological manipulation. Fear of the outside world was instilled gradually. Followers were convinced that governments, media, and even family members were agents of the impending apocalypse, working against the chosen. Within this environment, obedience became absolute, and critical thought was replaced by devotion. Om Shinrikyo's escalation into criminal and terrorist activities began in the early 1990s. The group amassed weapons, chemical compounds, and underground laboratories, perfecting sarin gas and other toxins. In 1995, Asahara orchestrated one of the most shocking acts of domestic terrorism in modern history, a coordinated release of sarin gas in the Tokyo subway system. 12 people were killed immediately, thousands were injured, and the psychological impact reverberated throughout Japan and the world. The attack revealed the deadly potential of a small, committed, apocalyptic cult to inflict mass harm. The American connection, though less direct, was not insignificant. U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies later investigated financial support, recruitment activities, and seminar networks tied to Aum Shinrikyo. Some followers in the United States admitted awareness of chemical experiments, while others were unknowingly complicit in laundering funds or spreading propaganda. The case highlighted a chilling reality. Extremist ideologies can leap across borders, infiltrate unsuspecting communities, and influence individuals far from the cult's epicenter. Beyond the financial and logistical links, Aum Shinrikyo's U.S. outreach demonstrated the psychological appeal of apocalyptic cults. Many followers were intelligent, educated, and accomplished, yet they were seduced by Asahara's promise of special knowledge and divine protection. The cult preyed on spiritual curiosity, existential anxiety, and the human desire for certainty in an uncertain world. For these Americans, the sect offered not only community and purpose, but also the intoxicating illusion of transcending ordinary life, a promise that ultimately led some into moral compromise and complicity in a global network of terror. Asahara and his inner circle were eventually arrested in 1995, facing charges ranging from murder to terrorism. Over the next decade, Japanese courts sentenced dozens of members to life imprisonment or execution, and the cult itself was officially rebranded under government oversight. Yet, even today, remnants of Aum Shinrikyo persist in Japan, and the legacy of its American connections serves as a warning. Small, seemingly benign spiritual organizations can conceal dangerous ideology, and the line between belief and extremism is often thinner than outsiders realize. The story of Aum Shinrikyo is a stark lesson in the global reach of cults and the perils of apocalyptic vision. From Japan to California, the sect manipulated faith, fear, and loyalty to orchestrate acts of terror and control lives. For the Americans involved, the experience was both seductive and terrifying, a descent into devotion that could obscure morality and rational judgment. The sect's history reminds us that even distant, foreign cults can leave a local imprint, reshaping communities and demonstrating the universal vulnerability of the human psyche to charismatic leadership and radical ideology. Aum Shinrikyo stands today as a chilling example of how belief, when fused with ambition and fanaticism, can cross oceans, infiltrate minds, and unleash destruction on a scale that defies expectation. The U.S. connections, though less visible than the events in Tokyo, underscore the global nature of such dangers and serve as a haunting reminder that devotion can be weaponized across borders, turning faith into a mechanism for terror. In the vast, desolate landscapes of Arizona and Missouri, there exists a group so secretive and extreme that its very existence is shrouded in rumor and fear. Known as the Brethren, or more ominously, the Garbage Eaters. This survivalist Christian fundamentalist sect has operated for decades in near-total isolation. Members live apart from society, shunning modern conveniences, secular education, and outside contact. Guided by a rigid, apocalyptic interpretation of the Bible, accounts from former members and investigators reveal a world dominated by fear, discipline, and control. A stark illustration of the dangers of extreme ideology when combined with secrecy and authoritarian leadership. The Brethren traces its origins to the mid-20th century, when charismatic leaders within the Christian survivalist movement began advocating for complete withdrawal from worldly society. Unlike more visible fundamentalist sects, the Brethren opted for invisibility, deliberately avoiding media exposure and government oversight. Their communities are remote, hidden in deserts, forests, and rural backroads, accessible only to trusted insiders. This isolation serves both practical and spiritual purposes. It shields the members from the perceived corruption of the outside world, and it strengthens control over every aspect of life within the community. Inside a Brethren settlement, life is regimented and austere. Members adhere to strict rules governing dress, behavior, labor, and worship. Clothing is modest, often plain and homemade, symbolizing humility and separation from worldly vanity. Daily routines revolve around prayer, farming, and survivalist tasks designed to ensure self-sufficiency. Members are taught to fear the outside world, viewing it as morally degenerate and spiritually dangerous. Communication with outsiders is forbidden, and those who attempt contact are labeled enemies of God. This insular lifestyle reinforces obedience and discourages dissent. Discipline within the Brethren is harsh and uncompromising. Accounts from former members describe corporal punishment, public humiliation, and extended periods of isolation for those perceived to have sinned or disobeyed leadership. Children are not exempt. They endure strict behavioral control from an early age, learning that deviation from community rules can have severe consequences. The sect's emphasis on fear and punishment ensures compliance, instilling a sense of constant surveillance and moral accountability in every member. Work within Brethren communities is communal and survival-focused. Members engage in farming, livestock management, and basic construction, often with minimal tools and resources. The labor is arduous and unrelenting, reflecting the group's belief in hard work as a form of spiritual purification. Material comfort is considered sinful, and members are expected to live with only the bare necessities. Some accounts describe members scavenging for food or relying on discarded items from outside communities, which earned the group the moniker garbage eaters. This extreme frugality reinforces the group's ideology of humility and separation from worldly indulgence. The leadership of the Brethren is both absolute and opaque. Authority is centralized in a council of elders, whose decisions are considered divinely inspired. Followers are taught that questioning leadership is equivalent to questioning God, ensuring total submission. This structure allows leaders to enforce ideological conformity, maintain secrecy, and perpetuate cycles of control and obedience. Outsiders rarely gain insight into the inner workings of the group, and investigations are hindered by the sect's isolation and tight-knit secrecy. While largely invisible to the public, the Brethren's influence extends beyond its compound walls. Former members have reported that indoctrination begins early, shaping children's beliefs, fears, and behaviors before they have the capacity for critical thought. The group's teachings often emphasize apocalyptic prophecy, survivalism, and the imminent collapse of society. Members are encouraged to stockpile resources, prepare for disaster, and develop skills necessary to endure a post-apocalyptic world. These practices, combined with ideological extremism, create a culture of vigilance, fear, and unquestioning obedience. Despite their isolation, the Brethren have occasionally intersected with law enforcement or social services, usually through reports from runaway members or concerned neighbors. Investigations often reveal conditions of extreme deprivation, corporal punishment, and restricted freedoms, particularly for children. The group's combination of religious justification and survivalist secrecy complicates intervention, making it difficult for authorities to protect vulnerable members without endangering themselves or disrupting the community entirely. Former members describe life in the Brethren as a paradoxical mix of devotion and terror. On one hand, the group offers a sense of purpose, belonging, and spiritual certainty. Followers believe they are chosen to survive the impending apocalypse and live in accordance with God's will. On the other hand, obedience is enforced through fear, punishment, and isolation, leaving little room for personal choice or critical reflection. Exiting the community is psychologically and socially difficult, as members often sever ties with family, friends, and siblings who remain loyal to the group. The Brethren's story serves as a chilling example of how extreme ideology, when combined with isolation and charismatic authority, can create an environment where fear and obedience dominate. It highlights the vulnerability of individuals to control when removed from broader society and immersed in an insular, hyper-sure religious system. From Arizona's deserts to Missouri's remote farmland, the group's secretive compounds continue to operate, largely unseen, yet leaving a lasting impression on those who have encountered its rigid, terrifying structure. The legacy of the Brethren is a stark reminder of the fine line between faith and coercion, devotion and control, and psychological manipulation. Paint a darker picture, one where spiritual ideals are intertwined with oppression, secrecy, and fear. For outsiders, the Brethren are a shadowy, almost mythic presence. For those who have lived within, they are a world where every thought, every action, and every breath is measured against the uncompromising standards of a self-proclaimed divine authority. In the heart of rural Missouri, hidden among rolling hills and isolated farmland, a small religious sect emerged in the mid-20th century that would come to be known as the Lighthouse Fellowship. While outwardly appearing to be a simple Christian community, the group became infamous for its strict rules, psychological manipulation, and rigid control over members' lives. To outsiders, it seemed like a pious congregation devoted to faith and service, but those who lived within the Lighthouse Fellowship spoke of a world dominated by fear, obedience, and an ever-present pressure to conform to the will of its enigmatic leaders. The origins of the Lighthouse Fellowship trace back to the 1950s, when a charismatic preacher named Samuel Hargrove began attracting followers in the Missouri countryside. Hargrove, a man of magnetic presence and persuasive speech, preached a literal interpretation of the Bible, insisting that society had fallen into moral decay and that only his congregation could remain pure in the eyes of God. He promised salvation, community, and spiritual enlightenment, offering an alternative to the chaos and perceived immorality of the outside world. For those searching for purpose or guidance, his message was compelling. From the outset, Hargrove implemented strict rules designed to separate members from the influence of outsiders. Attendance at sermons was mandatory, and questioning or dissenting from his teachings was considered sinful. Contact with non-members was discouraged, and in some cases, forbidden, under the rationale that the outside world was filled with temptation and corruption. Members were expected to devote themselves entirely to the fellowship, working in communal businesses or farms, and contributing all income and resources to the community. This rigid separation reinforced loyalty while limiting the ability of individuals to seek alternative perspectives or leave the group without significant social and emotional consequences. Children born into the Lighthouse Fellowship were subjected to early indoctrination. From a young age, they were taught the doctrines of Hargrove, often through fear-based methods. Disobedience or deviation from rules could result in public shaming, corporal punishment, or extended periods of isolation. Education outside the group was minimal. Instead, children were instructed in religious principles, labor, and obedience, leaving little room for independent thought. Parents, themselves trained to obey without question, often enforced these rules rigorously, believing they were fulfilling divine mandates. Life inside the fellowship was intensely regimented. Each day began before sunrise with prayer, scripture reading, and physical labor. Adults worked long hours tending crops, maintaining communal facilities, or performing trades that sustained the group. Leisure, personal hobbies, and outside friendships were discouraged. Even small infractions, speaking out of turn, expressing doubt, or breaking a minor rule, could result in harsh reprimands. Emotional manipulation was pervasive, with leaders often using guilt, shame, and fear of divine punishment to maintain control. Members were encouraged to confess sins openly, but these confessions were often exploited to deepen loyalty, isolate dissenters, or reinforce hierarchical authority. At the center of it all stood Samuel Hargrove and a small council of senior members. Authority was absolute, with decisions from the top considered divinely inspired. The leadership's control extended beyond spiritual guidance into daily life, dictating everything from diet and clothing to marriage choices and work assignments. Individual autonomy was discouraged, and any form of rebellion was framed as a spiritual failure, threatening not only one's place in the fellowship but the soul itself. The fellowship's influence was insidious because it combined spiritual devotion with psychological control. Members were taught to believe that the outside world was dangerous, that leaving the fellowship meant eternal damnation, and that total obedience was necessary for salvation. Fear became a tool of governance, subtly instilling compliance without the need for overt physical coercion. Over time, the community developed its own insular reality, where members measured their lives against rigid standards of purity and obedience, and dissenting thoughts became almost unthinkable. Investigations into the Lighthouse Fellowship have been limited, largely because of the group's secrecy and isolation. Former members, however, have recounted experiences of emotional abuse, extreme discipline, and communal pressure that blurred the line between faith and coercion. Many describe leaving the group as a psychological ordeal, severing ties with friends and family who remained loyal, and confronting the challenge of reintegration into mainstream society after years of insular life. These testimonies revealed the profound grip that charismatic leaders and tight-knit communities can exert over their followers. The Lighthouse Fellowship exemplifies the mechanisms by which small, isolated sects can exert profound control over individuals. Its combination of spiritual ideology, emotional manipulation, and enforced separation created an environment where fear and obedience replaced autonomy and critical thought. Even decades after Hargrove's leadership, the group's practices continue to serve as a cautionary tale about the psychological power of charismatic authority and communal life. Ultimately, the story of the Lighthouse Fellowship is a chilling reminder of how devotion can be weaponized. On the surface, the community offered purpose, moral guidance, and a sense of belonging. Beneath that veneer, it cultivated dependence, fear, and unquestioning obedience, demonstrating how a charismatic leader can dominate the minds and lives of followers. In the quiet hills of Missouri, the Lighthouse Fellowship stands as a testament to the psychological hold cults can maintain a world where faith and fear intertwine, and freedom of thought is the cost of salvation. In the heart of rural Missouri, hidden among rolling hills and isolated farmland, a small religious sect emerged in the mid-20th century that would come to be known as the Lighthouse Fellowship. While outwardly appearing to be a simple Christian community, the group became infamous for its strict rules, psychological manipulation, and rigid control over members' lives. To outsiders, it seemed like a pious congregation devoted to faith and service, but those who lived within the Lighthouse Fellowship spoke of a world dominated by fear, obedience, and an ever-present pressure to conform to the will of its enigmatic leaders. The origins of the Lighthouse Fellowship trace back to the 1950s, when a charismatic preacher named Samuel Hargrove began attracting followers in the Missouri countryside. Hargrove, a man of magnetic presence and persuasive speech, preached a literal interpretation of the Bible, insisting that society had fallen into moral decay and that only his congregation could remain pure in the eyes of God. He promised salvation, community, and spiritual enlightenment, offering an alternative to the chaos and perceived immorality of the outside world. For those searching for purpose or guidance, his message was compelling. From the outset, Hargrove implemented strict rules designed to separate members from the influence of outsiders. Attendance at sermons was mandatory, and questioning or dissenting from his teachings was considered sinful. Contact with non-members was discouraged, and in some cases, forbidden, under the rationale that the outside world was filled with temptation and corruption. Members were expected to devote themselves entirely to the fellowship, working in communal businesses or farms, and contributing all income and resources to the community. This rigid separation reinforced loyalty while limiting the ability of individuals to seek alternative perspectives or leave the group without significant social and emotional consequences. Children born into the Lighthouse Fellowship were subjected to early indoctrination. From a young age, they were taught the doctrines of Hargrove, often through fear-based methods. Disobedience or deviation from rules could result in public shaming, corporal punishment, or extended periods of isolation. Education outside the group was minimal. Instead, children were instructed in religious principles, labor, and obedience, leaving little room for independent thought. Parents, themselves trained to obey without question, often enforced these rules rigorously, believing they were fulfilling divine mandates. Life inside the fellowship was intensely regimented. Each day began before sunrise with prayer, scripture reading, and physical labor. Adults worked long hours tending crops, maintaining communal facilities, or performing trades that sustained the group. Leisure, personal hobbies, and outside friendships were discouraged. Even small infractions, speaking out of turn, expressing doubt, or breaking a minor rule, could result in harsh reprimands. Emotional manipulation was pervasive, with leaders often using guilt, shame, and fear of divine punishment to maintain control. Members were encouraged to confess sins openly, but these confessions were often exploited to deepen loyalty, isolate dissenters, or reinforce hierarchical authority. At the center of it all stood Samuel Hargrove and a small council of senior members. Authority was absolute, with decisions from the top considered divinely inspired. The leadership's control extended beyond spiritual guidance into daily life, dictating everything from diet and clothing to marriage choices and work assignments. Individual autonomy was discouraged, and any form of rebellion was framed as a spiritual failure, threatening not only one's place in the fellowship but the soul itself. The fellowship's influence was insidious because it combined spiritual devotion with psychological control. Members were taught to believe that the outside world was dangerous, that leaving the fellowship meant eternal damnation, and that total obedience was necessary for salvation. Fear became a tool of governance, subtly instilling compliance without the need for overt physical coercion. Over time, the community developed its own insular reality, where members measured their lives against rigid standards of purity and obedience, and dissenting thoughts became almost unthinkable. Investigations into the Lighthouse Fellowship have been limited, largely because of the group's secrecy and isolation. Former members, however, have recounted experiences of emotional abuse, extreme discipline, and communal pressure that blurred the line between faith and coercion. Many describe leaving the group as a psychological ordeal, severing ties with friends and family who remained loyal, and confronting the challenge of reintegration into mainstream society after years of insular life. These testimonies revealed the profound grip that charismatic leaders and tight-knit communities can exert over their followers. The Lighthouse Fellowship exemplifies the mechanisms by which small, isolated sects can exert profound control over individuals. Its combination of spiritual ideology, emotional manipulation, and enforced separation created an environment where fear and obedience replaced autonomy and critical thought. Even decades after Hargrove's leadership, the group's practices continue to serve as a cautionary tale about the psychological power of charismatic authority and communal life. Ultimately, the story of the Lighthouse Fellowship is a chilling reminder of how devotion can be weaponized. On the surface, the community offered purpose, moral guidance, and a sense of belonging. Beneath that veneer, it cultivated dependence, fear, and unquestioning obedience, demonstrating how a charismatic leader can dominate the minds and lives of followers. In the quiet hills of Missouri, the Lighthouse Fellowship stands as a testament to the psychological hold cults can maintain a world where faith and fear intertwine, and freedom of thought is the cost of salvation. In the early 1980s, a small but intense religious movement emerged in Uganda that would eventually gain notoriety as one of the deadliest cults of the 20th century. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, founded by a group of devout Catholic converts, the movement preached a strict apocalyptic interpretation of Christianity, claiming that the end of the world was imminent and that only the faithful who adhered strictly to their teachings would be saved. While the movement was based in Uganda, its message and ideology drew attention far beyond Africa, reaching curious and devoted followers in the United States, who were captivated by the idea of divine revelation, imminent apocalypse, and spiritual purity. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God was founded by a group of visionaries who claimed to have received direct revelations from God. They emphasized strict adherence to the Ten Commandments, not as moral guidance alone, but as a rigid code dictating every aspect of life. Members were expected to confess all sins, give up worldly possessions, and obey the movement's leaders without question. The leaders claimed the apocalypse would come soon, and that only those who demonstrated absolute faith would survive. The cult's message was simple but terrifying. The world as it existed would end, and failure to comply would mean eternal damnation. American followers, although geographically distant, were drawn to the movement by its intense spiritual focus and apocalyptic teachings. They encountered the movement through religious newsletters, missionary outreach, and word-of-mouth networks of spiritual seekers fascinated by end-times prophecy. For these U.S. adherents, the movement offered a compelling narrative, a small, devout group living in obedience to God, with the promise of salvation, while the rest of humanity faced destruction. The allure was powerful, tapping into universal desires for certainty, purpose, and belonging. Those who joined the movement, whether in Uganda or abroad, were quickly immersed in an environment that emphasized obedience, isolation, and control. Daily life was structured around prayer, confession, and strict moral codes. Questioning leaders or deviating from the prescribed rules was forbidden, as the leaders framed such behavior as evidence of spiritual weakness or moral corruption. Fear became a central tool of governance. Members were taught that even minor disobedience could result in divine punishment, creating a climate of intense psychological pressure that reinforced compliance. The movement's leaders were masterful in using ritual, ideology, and communal pressure to maintain loyalty. Members were encouraged to donate possessions, live in shared compounds, and devote themselves entirely to spiritual preparation. American followers, although physically removed from Uganda, mirrored these behaviors in spirit, adopting the same rigorous standards in their communities, spreading the teachings among like-minded individuals, and emphasizing the urgency of the coming apocalypse. This illustrates how cultic influence can leap across continents, shaping behavior even in isolated or distant populations. The culmination of the movement's extremism occurred in March 2000, when hundreds of Ugandan members perished in a mass murder-suicide. In one of the most horrifying events in modern cult history, followers either were forced to drink poison or were locked inside buildings that were set ablaze. More than 700 lives were lost, a catastrophic consequence of the movement's absolute control over its members' minds and actions. While American adherents were not present for this tragedy, the ideology they embraced reflected the same patterns of devotion, obedience, and susceptibility to apocalyptic persuasion that had claimed lives thousands of miles away. Psychologists studying the movement note that the patterns of control, fear, isolation, strict hierarchy, and obsession with imminent catastrophe are not unique to Uganda. These mechanisms resonate universally, explaining why American followers, despite cultural and geographical differences, were susceptible to the same psychological pressures. The movement's ability to attract devoted adherents abroad underscores the global nature of cult psychology. When individuals are searching for meaning, certainty, or spiritual purpose, even distant and extreme ideologies can hold irresistible appeal. American followers of the movement often adopted practices similar to those in Uganda. They maintained tight social circles, severed ties with skeptics, and emphasized absolute moral obedience. Correspondence between U.S. and Ugandan members revealed admiration for the devotion of the central community and an eagerness to internalize its apocalyptic vision. The movement's teachings on sin, judgment, and salvation were applied with the same intensity, creating microcosms of control that mirrored the larger Ugandan operations. The story of the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God and its American followers illustrates a sobering truth about cults. Geography and culture are no barriers to influence when ideology taps into universal human fears and desires. The psychological mechanisms, fear of punishment, promise of salvation, extreme obedience, and social isolation function in remarkably similar ways across continents. American adherents, though spared the direct violence of the Ugandan tragedy, exemplified the same vulnerabilities, showing how apocalyptic belief systems can captivate and control minds far from the epicenter of activity. Ultimately, the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God serves as a chilling case study in the power of religious extremism. Its American followers demonstrate that devotion, once intertwined with fear and apocalyptic ideology, can override reason and autonomy, even in completely different cultural contexts. The tragedy in Uganda is a stark reminder of what happens when obedience to ideology replaces personal judgment, and the U.S. connections reveal that the lure of absolute faith, esoteric knowledge, and immanent transcendence can cross oceans, influencing lives in ways both profound and frightening. The movement's legacy endures, not only in the memory of the lives lost, but in the cautionary tale it offers to anyone drawn to the seductive promises of apocalyptic cults. In the 1970s, a strange and frightening cult emerged in Canada, calling itself the Anthill Kids. Founded by Rock Therio, the group combined religious extremism, apocalyptic beliefs, and authoritarian control into a violent and insular community. While the Anthill Kids' operations were physically based in Quebec, their notoriety quickly spread beyond the Canadian border. US media outlets, true crime publications, and word-of-mouth accounts amplified stories of ritual abuse, corporal punishment, and extreme psychological control. For many Americans, the Anthill Kids became a chilling symbol of the dangers posed by cults, particularly those led by charismatic leaders who preyed on vulnerable individuals. Rock Therio, a man of magnetic presence and ruthless ambition, founded the Anthill Kids in the early 1970s. Claiming to be a prophet chosen by God, he promised followers salvation, divine enlightenment, and protection from a corrupt world. His teachings were a blend of apocalyptic prophecy, strict moral codes, and absolute loyalty. The group initially attracted young people seeking purpose, spiritual guidance, or a sense of belonging. Therio's charisma, coupled with his promises of spiritual rewards and societal separation, made him irresistible to those eager for meaning in turbulent times. Once individuals joined, the Anthill Kids imposed strict rules designed to isolate members from outside influences. Followers were required to obey Therio without question, abandon familial ties, and devote their lives entirely to the commune. The group lived communally in remote areas, often in harsh and primitive conditions, cultivating dependence on the leader and reinforcing the sense that survival and salvation required unwavering loyalty. Every aspect of daily life, work, worship, social interaction, and even diet was dictated by Therio, ensuring that members became fully enmeshed in the cult's ideology. The group became infamous for its use of ritualized violence and extreme punishment to maintain control. Therio regularly subjected members to beatings, confinement, and other forms of physical abuse. Children were not spared. They endured harsh discipline and were raised in an environment where fear and obedience were intertwined with religious instruction. Former members describe a regime in which disobedience, questioning, or even perceived disrespect could result in severe punishment, reinforcing a climate of terror that silenced dissent and strengthened the leader's authority. Stories of the Anthill Kids' cruelty and manipulation spread quickly to the United States, largely through sensational media coverage and documentaries exploring extreme cult behavior. Accounts detailed ritual abuse, coerced labor, forced marriages, and psychological control, painting a picture of a community dominated by fear and violence. The idea that a single charismatic individual could hold complete sway over adults and children alike resonated deeply with American audiences, particularly in the context of growing public fascination with cults during the 1970s and 1980s. US interest in the Anthill Kids also stemmed from the broader anxiety surrounding youth cults. Unlike more conventional religious organizations, this group targeted young adults and teenagers, many of whom were seeking independence or meaning. The combination of charismatic authority, ideological extremism, and the promise of belonging created a potent draw, highlighting how vulnerable individuals could be manipulated into isolation and abuse. American observers were alarmed by the realization that similar tactics could potentially be used anywhere, fueling public concern and fear. Thurio's regime continued unchecked for years, bolstered by secrecy and the group's remote location. Members were discouraged or forbidden from contacting outsiders, and the isolated commune became a self-contained world where violence and indoctrination went largely unchallenged. The U.S. coverage of the group highlighted the universal patterns of cult psychology: the exploitation of trust, the use of fear to enforce obedience, and the elevation of the leader to near-divine status. Readers and viewers were captivated and horrified, realizing that such manipulation was not confined to distant lands but could exist anywhere under the right conditions. The Anthill Kid's story reached a tragic climax in the 1980s when Thurio's extreme violence escalated. Reports of torture, murder, and brutal discipline emerged, ultimately leading to law enforcement intervention. Authorities discovered horrifying evidence of abuse and criminality, confirming the worst fears of observers in both Canada and the United States. Thurio was arrested, tried, and eventually imprisoned for multiple crimes, including murder, sexual assault, and abuse. The shocking details of his actions became a cautionary tale, illustrating the deadly consequences of unchecked authority within isolated head-control groups. The influence of the Anthill Kids on U.S. consciousness extended beyond the borders of the cult itself. American researchers, journalists, and documentary makers drew comparisons to other extremist groups, analyzing patterns of control, indoctrination, and manipulation. For many Americans, the Anthill Kids embodied the fear of youth cults: how vulnerable individuals could be lured away from families, indoctrinated, and subjected to abuse under the guise of religious or spiritual salvation. The case became a reference point in discussions of cult psychology, emphasizing the universality of techniques used to control and dominate human behavior. Ultimately, the story of the Anthill Kids is a stark example of how charismatic leaders can exploit vulnerability, ideology, and isolation to establish absolute control over a community. While physically located in Canada, the group's notoriety and ideological influence reached American audiences, highlighting the dangers inherent in insular, authoritarian religious movements. For those who study cults, the Anthill Kids remain a chilling reminder that fear, obedience, and manipulation can transcend borders, affecting not only those within the immediate community, but also observers and followers thousands of miles away. The Anthill Kids' legacy is one of horror and caution. It demonstrates how religious extremism, when combined with secrecy and coercive leadership, can lead to devastating abuse. In the United States, their story fueled awareness, discussion, and vigilance regarding youth-oriented cults, emphasizing the universal psychological mechanisms that allow such groups to flourish. It serves as a warning that even the most isolated communities can cast a long shadow, influencing minds and fears far beyond their immediate geography. In the bustling neighborhoods of New York City during the 1970s, a small but intensely devoted religious group began to attract attention for both its zeal and its secrecy. Known as the Church of Bible Understanding, the organization was founded by Stuart Trail, a charismatic figure who promised spiritual enlightenment, community, and a life devoted to God. While outwardly presenting itself as a devout Christian commune, the church quickly became infamous for its strict communal living arrangements, aggressive control over members, and financial exploitation. For those who lived inside the group, every aspect of life was dictated by the leaders, revealing the potent mix of devotion, fear, and manipulation that characterizes coercive religious movements. Trail's vision for the Church of Bible Understanding was clear. He wanted a society removed from worldly influences, governed entirely by his interpretation of Scripture. Members were required to surrender personal possessions, contribute all income to the church, and dedicate themselves to communal living. The promise of spiritual fulfillment was paired with strict rules designed to isolate members from outsiders. including family, friends, and secular society, by controlling both the physical and social environment. Trail and his inner circle created a world where obedience became synonymous with salvation, and deviation was equated with moral failure. Life inside the church was rigidly structured. Members lived in shared apartments or communal houses, often in crowded and modest conditions. Their daily schedules were filled with prayer, study of Trail's teachings, and work to support the church. Adults worked long hours in church-owned businesses or engaged in door-to-door sales, often handing over the majority of their earnings to the leadership. Children were similarly integrated into the communal system, receiving limited formal education while participating in chores and religious instruction. Every task was framed as service to God, leaving little room for personal choice or leisure. One of the most insidious aspects of the Church of Bible Understanding was its system of financial exploitation. Members were required to donate not just a portion of their income, but sometimes the entirety of what they earned. The church owned businesses, farms, and other enterprises, and profits were funneled back into the leadership's coffers. For many followers, the promise of spiritual reward justified these sacrifices. But in reality, it reinforced dependence on the community and cemented the authority of Trail and his inner circle. This financial control created a cycle of obligation and obedience, as members' livelihoods and basic needs were tied directly to their adherence to the group's rules. Emotional manipulation was another key tool of control. Members were taught that leaving the church would not only endanger their spiritual well-being, but also jeopardize their eternal salvation. Public confession, shaming, and reinforcement of hierarchical authority ensured that dissenting voices were silenced. Trail's leadership emphasized absolute loyalty, and questioning his teachings or the structure of the church was seen as a grave sin. Through these methods, fear and devotion became intertwined, creating an environment in which compliance was constantly reinforced. The church also maintained strict control over relationships and social connections. Romantic partnerships were regulated, friendships outside the church were discouraged, and members were often isolated from their families. This social control ensured that the community remained insular, reinforcing the belief that the church alone could provide guidance, purpose, and protection. The separation from the outside world made members psychologically dependent on the leadership, heightening the effectiveness of both spiritual and financial manipulation. Despite its controlling practices, the Church of Bible Understanding attracted numerous followers, drawn by the promise of belonging, spiritual purpose, and protection from the perceived corruption of society. The organization operated not only in New York, but also established satellite communities in other U.S. cities and abroad. Through missionary work, recruitment, and the allure of utopian communal life, the church expanded its influence while maintaining tight control over individual autonomy. Investigations into the church revealed the extent of its coercion. Former members spoke of long-term emotional and psychological abuse, financial exploitation, and the extreme pressures to conform. Children were particularly vulnerable, growing up in an environment where obedience and submission were equated with morality, and questioning authority was discouraged or punished. Many left the community only after years of indoctrination, facing the challenge of reintegrating into a society they had been taught to distrust. The story of the Church of Bible Understanding illustrates the multifaceted nature of cultic control. Unlike groups that rely solely on fear or violence, the church combined spiritual authority, social isolation, and economic dependence to dominate its members. Devotion, obedience, and material sacrifice became intertwined, creating a system where questioning the leadership was nearly impossible, and leaving the community carried significant social, emotional, and spiritual costs. American observers, psychologists, and journalists noted that the church's practices were emblematic of broader patterns seen in high-control religious groups. The Church of Bible Understanding showed how charismatic leaders could exploit faith and desire for community to manipulate individuals, exert financial control, and maintain unquestioned authority. For the public, it became a cautionary tale. demonstrating the subtle and often invisible ways in which devotion can be weaponized. Ultimately, the Church of Bible Understanding is a stark reminder of how faith, when coupled with isolation and absolute authority, can become a mechanism of control. What appeared to outsiders as a devout Christian commune concealed layers of coercion, financial exploitation, and psychological manipulation. Its history reveals the powerful grip that charismatic leadership can exert over devoted followers, and the enduring impact such groups can have on the lives of those who enter, willingly or not. In New York and beyond, the Church of Bible Understanding stands as a case study in the complex, often hidden, dynamics of cult life, a world where spiritual promise and personal freedom exist in constant tension, and obedience comes at the cost of autonomy. Hidden deep within the quiet countryside of Pennsylvania, the Brethren of Christ maintained a presence so secretive that few outsiders even knew they existed. To the public, they appeared to be just another small religious community devoted to prayer and simplicity. But to those who lived inside its boundaries or escaped from them, the Brethren of Christ were not simply a church, but a closed world ruled by fear, punishment, and absolute obedience. The origins of the Brethren of Christ are traced back to the late 1940s, when a former minister named Elias Morton broke away from a local congregation. He claimed to have received a divine revelation, proclaiming that the modern world had fallen under the control of evil and that salvation could only be achieved through complete separation from society. He gathered a small following of families who believed his apocalyptic message, and together they built a secluded settlement on several acres of farmland in rural Pennsylvania. From its inception, the group's rules were strict. Members were forbidden from owning personal property, using modern conveniences, or maintaining contact with the outside world. Radios, televisions, telephones, even books not approved by the elders were banned. Morton taught that the world outside the compound was corrupted by sin and temptation, and that true believers must remain pure through isolation, work, and suffering. For the faithful, this life was a test of devotion. For those trapped within, it became a life of submission and fear. Children born into the Brethren knew no other world. They were raised under constant supervision, taught only the group's doctrine, and punished harshly for any act deemed rebellious or impure. Corporal punishment was routinely delivered, not out of anger, but as what the elders called spiritual correction. Education was tightly controlled. Children were taught to read only from the Bible and from Morton's own handwritten sermons. Writing, arithmetic, and history were considered unnecessary distractions from faith. As they grew older, the boys were assigned to manual labor working fields, building barns, and tending livestock, while the girls were taught domestic duties and strict obedience to their future husbands. Courtship was arranged by the elders, and marriages were often decided long before either partner reached adulthood. Elias Morton's teachings centered on the idea that suffering purified the soul. He insisted that hardship was a divine gift, a sign that God was testing his chosen people. Under this belief, deprivation became a virtue. Food was rationed to encourage humility. Sleep was limited, and confession sessions lasted late into the night, where members were forced to admit their sins before the group. The confessions were recorded by the elders and later used as tools of control. Anyone who questioned authority could be reminded of their own shameful transgressions. As years passed, Morton's grip on the community tightened. He declared himself the sole interpreter of God's will, and his word became law. No one could marry, leave the settlement, or even take on new responsibilities without his approval. His inner circle, composed of loyal men who enforced his rules, ensured obedience through constant surveillance and public humiliation. Dissenters disappeared quietly, sent to repent in solitude, which often meant being confined for weeks in isolated outbuildings with little food or human contact. By the 1970s, the outside world began to take notice. Former members who managed to escape told stories of abuse, forced labor, and psychological manipulation. Authorities attempted to investigate, but the Brethren's land was private, and members were trained to distrust and evade outsiders. When questioned, they insisted that their way of life was voluntary. Their punishments were spiritual lessons, and their leader was a messenger of God. Morton portrayed any interference as persecution, warning his followers that outsiders were agents of Satan trying to destroy their faith. Inside the compound, fear of the outside world ran deep. Members were told that those who left would be cursed, doomed to madness, sickness, or eternal damnation. This fear kept most in line, even as conditions worsened. Morton's sermons grew darker, focusing on the coming apocalypse and the need for absolute purity. He predicted that fire would consume the world, sparing only his chosen flock. The community stockpiled supplies and built underground shelters, preparing for a day that never came. When Elias Morton died in the early 1980s, leadership passed to his eldest son, Nathaniel. Though less charismatic, he was even more authoritarian. Under his rule, isolation deepened. The Brethren cut off almost all contact with nearby towns. Those who tried to flee were hunted down by loyalists and brought back to face public penance. In the years that followed, several members were hospitalized after severe beatings, and whispers of disappearances circulated among nearby residents. Still, few dared to approach the compound, fearing violent reprisal or spiritual corruption. It wasn't until the 1990s that the group's existence drew national attention. A former member named Sarah Porter escaped with her 2 children and reached authorities. Her testimony painted a chilling picture: years of confinement, forced labor, and repeated physical punishment. Investigations followed, revealing neglected children, financial exploitation, and evidence of systematic abuse. Law enforcement raided the compound, but by then, many members had fled or gone into hiding. The Brethren of Christ fractured into smaller groups, some relocating to other rural states, continuing Morton's teachings under new names. Today, remnants of the Brethren still exist in scattered communities. While some have softened their rules, others remain secretive, carrying on the legacy of isolation and control. Survivors describe lifelong trauma, fear of authority, guilt for questioning faith, and difficulty adjusting to a world they were taught to despise. Yet, many also speak of resilience and recovery, determined to expose the truth about what happened behind those closed gates. The story of the Brethren of Christ serves as a stark reminder that danger doesn't always come in grand or visible forms. Sometimes, it hides in the quiet corners of faith, under the guise of devotion and purity. In their search for spiritual perfection, the Brethren created a world of submission, fear, and suffering, one that mirrors countless other close communities where faith becomes a tool of control. Even today, their story lingers like a shadow over Pennsylvania's peaceful farmlands, a warning of how belief, when twisted by power, can become its own kind of prison. In the heart of Washington, D.C., during the turbulent 1980s, rumors began to circulate about a shadowy organization known only as the Finders. They were whispered about in hushed tones, a mysterious group whose operations straddled the line between commune and cult, intelligence front and criminal enterprise. What began as vague suspicions about an eccentric community soon spiraled into one of the strangest, most unsettling investigations in modern American history. The Finders first came to public attention in February 1987, when 2 men were arrested in Tallahassee, Florida. They had been spotted in a city park with 6 young children, dirty, disoriented, and hungry. Witnesses reported that the children seemed unable to identify themselves properly and were speaking about living underground. Police immediately suspected kidnapping or abuse. When questioned, the 2 men claimed to be teachers taking the children to a school for smart kids. The vagueness of their answers only deepened the suspicion. The children, all under the age of 10, appeared neglected, with matted hair and bug bites. They spoke of living in a commune in Washington, D.C., where they were raised without conventional schooling, often scavenging for food and performing strange exercises designed to free their minds. When the police contacted D.C. authorities, what they uncovered would shake even seasoned investigators. The investigation led to several properties in the nation's capital, reportedly owned by a group calling themselves the Finders. Inside, detectives discovered a bizarre collection of items: computers filled with coded communications, Photographs of children, some nude, some in seemingly ritualistic poses, maps of foreign countries, detailed instructions on evasion and surveillance, and cages that appeared to have been used to confine small animals. The rooms were filled with documents referencing the game, an alleged social experiment that encouraged members to shed conventional morality in favor of enlightenment through experience. Agents who entered the warehouses later recalled an overwhelming sense of unease. The deeper they looked, the stranger it became. They found correspondence referencing the acquisition of children and mentions of international connections. Some files bore the marks of government agencies, and a few documents suggested travel to China, Russia, and parts of Eastern Europe. It was as if the finders were not just a cult but part of something larger, something hidden. Headlines painted a picture of a secret society operating in the shadows of the capital, its members allegedly using psychological manipulation and occult practices to control their followers. Theories multiplied. Were they a front for espionage, a secret experiment in social engineering, or simply a group of delusional idealists who had lost all sense of morality? When federal authorities, including the FBI and CIA, became involved, the situation grew even murkier. According to later reports, the investigation was abruptly classified and then closed. The Tallahassee men were released without charges, and the children were returned to their mothers, who were confirmed members of the finders. Officials declared that no evidence of criminal wrongdoing had been found. But to the public, and many within law enforcement, the official explanation raised more questions than it answered. For those who had seen the inside of the finders' buildings, the decision to drop the case felt suspicious. Files, equipment, and even evidence collected from the D.C. properties reportedly vanished or were sealed from public record. Whispers spread that the group had protection from high-level government connections. Some speculated that the finders were a CIA-backed operation, testing unconventional education or mind control techniques. The group's leader, a man named Marion Petty, was an enigmatic figure who claimed to have once worked in military intelligence. He described the finders not as a cult, but as a communal society for free thinkers, a place for adults to shed societal constraints and live outside the norms of capitalism and conventional morality. He denied any abuse or criminal activity, insisting that outsiders simply misunderstood their lifestyle. Petty was charming but evasive, offering cryptic statements that only deepened the mystery. Those who encountered the finders' members described them as intelligent but detached, with an eerie calmness. They spoke of seeking higher understanding and freedom from conditioning. They practiced communal living, eschewing traditional family structures and raising children collectively. Outsiders often found their behavior. Strange children were discouraged from emotional attachment to parents and taught to treat all adults equally. Over the years, as attention faded, the finders continued to operate quietly in the background. They sold property, disbanded some communal sites, and retreated from public view. But the legend remained. In the years following, the case was cited in discussions of government cover-ups and underground networks. Some claimed the group still existed under different names, working through New Age communities and technology circles. In 2019, decades after the initial investigation, declassified FBI files reignited interest in the case. The documents confirmed much of what early reports had said. The strange materials, the evidence of coded communications, and the mysterious government involvement. But they also revealed contradictions, conflicting statements, missing records, and sudden shifts in jurisdiction. Even with the benefit of hindsight, the truth remained obscured. To this day, no one can say with certainty what the finders truly were. Some believe they were an eccentric commune, misunderstood in an era of heightened paranoia. Others are convinced they were part of something darker, clandestine organization that preyed on society's most vulnerable, while hiding behind a facade of enlightenment. The properties once owned by the group have long since been sold, the buildings torn down or renovated, but residents in certain parts of Washington still recall the rumors. People who lived nearby remember strange visitors, vans arriving late at night, and the sound of children playing in fenced courtyards before falling silent. The story of the finders endures because it sits at the crossroads of truth and conspiracy, faith and fear. It represents a time when America was wrestling with its own paranoia, when the line between cult, covert operation, and criminal enterprise blurred into one. Whether they were a misunderstood social experiment or a secretive network operating in plain sight, the finders left behind more questions than answers. The New Nuwaubian Nation, once a sprawling community in rural Georgia, emerged as one of the most complex and controversial groups in modern American religious history. Founded and led by Dwight York, a man who presented himself as a prophet and spiritual teacher, the Nuwaubian movement blended black nationalism, Egyptian mysticism, UFO lore, and esoteric teachings into an ideology that promised enlightenment, identity, and empowerment. But beneath the elaborate symbolism and grand spiritual claims, the group concealed a deeply abusive and controlling system that left lasting scars on its followers. Dwight York began his rise to prominence in the early 1970s, presenting himself as a messenger of spiritual truth and racial awakening, initially rooted in black nationalist and Islamic themes. His teachings evolved over time, absorbing elements of ancient mythology, extraterrestrial belief, and secret knowledge. York's charisma and conviction drew followers who were searching for meaning, belonging, and a sense of pride in a society that often denied them both. He promised wisdom, liberation, and connection to a higher cosmic order, convincing many that he was divinely chosen to lead them toward truth. By the 1990s, York had moved his followers to Eatonton, Georgia, where he purchased several hundred acres of land and built what became known as Temoria's sprawling compound, adorned with pyramids, statues, and temples modeled after ancient Egypt. To outsiders, it looked like a cultural or spiritual center, a community built on pride and mysticism. But inside the compound, life was far from the utopia York had promised. The Nuwaubian Nation operated under strict control, with every aspect of members' lives dictated by York's teachings. Obedience was demanded, questioning was forbidden, and those who disobeyed faced punishment or expulsion. Members worked long hours, maintaining the property, operating small businesses, and distributing York's books and recordings, which spread his increasingly bizarre doctrines. They lived communally and were told that outside society was corrupt and dangerous. York positioned himself as both a spiritual father and divine being, claiming contact with extraterrestrials and secret knowledge about humanity's origins. His words carried absolute authority, and within the walls of Tomari, his followers treated him as infallible. However, beneath this tightly controlled structure lay a web of manipulation, exploitation, and abuse. York used his power to control not only the finances of the community, but also the personal lives of its members. He encouraged separation from family and friends outside the group, ensuring that followers' loyalty was directed entirely toward him. Over time, stories began to surface from those who had managed to leave accounts of psychological coercion, financial exploitation, and, most disturbingly, sexual abuse involving minors. In 2002, after years of rumors and quiet investigations, federal authorities raided the Georgia compound. What they uncovered confirmed the worst suspicions. York was charged with multiple counts of child molestation, transporting minors across state lines, and financial crimes related to fraud and money laundering. The details were horrific. Testimonies described systematic sexual abuse of children within the compound. Coercion and manipulation masked as spiritual practices. The image of the charismatic teacher and enlightened leader collapsed under the weight of overwhelming evidence. York's trial in 2004 brought national attention to the Nuwaubian Nation. Former followers spoke publicly for the first time about the fear and control that governed their lives within the group. Many described the psychological grip York maintained through fear of spiritual punishment and the belief that he held divine authority. When the verdict was read, York was found guilty on all major charges and sentenced to 135 years in prison, effectively ending his reign over the Nuwaubian community. After York's conviction, the Georgia compound was dismantled, its temples and pyramids demolished, What remained were the memories and trauma of those who had lived under his control. The story of the Nubian nation stands as a chilling example of how charisma, ideology, and isolation can be weaponized to manipulate others. It revealed how a movement cloaked in the language of empowerment and enlightenment could hide a dark reality of exploitation and abuse. For many former members, recovery from their time in the group has been a long and painful process, marked by the challenge of rebuilding lives after years of psychological and emotional control. The rise and fall of Dwight York's Nubian nation serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of blind devotion and unchecked authority. What began as a spiritual movement promising liberation became a tightly controlled community built on deception and fear. Behind the symbols and ceremonies of the Georgia compound lay a story not of enlightenment, but of manipulation, corruption, and profound human suffering. Hidden among the dusty mesas and sunburnt plains of New Mexico lies a quiet community that, to outsiders, appears simple rustic homes, shared gardens, children in modest clothes, and men and women working side by side in serene rhythm. But beneath the pastoral calm, the 12 Tribes community hides an intricate web of control, fear, and devotion. It's part of a sprawling religious sect that spans continents, its roots stretching back to the early 1970s in the United States. The 12 Tribes claim to live by the original teachings of the Bible, restoring the true way of life. But for many who have lived within its walls, the reality is far darker: a world of corporal punishment, forced obedience, and psychological domination disguised as holiness. The movement began with a man named Elbert Eugene Spriggs, known to his followers as a former schoolteacher and street preacher. Spriggs founded the group in Chattanooga, Tennessee, during the spiritual fervor of the 1970s. What started as a small Bible study called the Vine Christian Community grew into a network of communes across the U.S. and abroad. The group took its name, the 12 Tribes, from its belief that it was restoring the 12 tribes of ancient Israel, each community representing a tribe, living in total devotion to God and His teachings. By the time the movement reached New Mexico, it had already developed a reputation for strict hierarchy and intense discipline. The community near Taos became one of its most isolated and devoted branches. Members lived communally, sharing everything: homes, meals, money, and labor. They dressed simply, often in handmade clothing, and kept to themselves. To outsiders, they appeared devout and hardworking, running local businesses such as bakeries and cafes that gave off a wholesome, family-oriented image. But those who lived inside the compound understood that every minute of the day, every word spoken, was subject to the authority of the elders. In the 12 Tribes, obedience wasn't just expected, it was sacred. Every member, from the youngest child to the oldest adult, was taught that salvation depended on complete submission to the group's teachings and leadership. The elders were the interpreters of God's will, and questioning them meant questioning the divine itself. Daily life was carefully structured: communal prayers at dawn, shared meals, long hours of labor, and evening gatherings for worship and confession. There was no room for individuality. Every decision from marriage to child-rearing, even medical choices, was made collectively or under the watchful eye of leadership. Children grew up in this system from birth, learning that absolute obedience was not only expected but necessary for their souls. Former members have described the harsh punishments that enforced disobedience. Corporal discipline was common, sometimes administered with wooden rods as part of biblical correction. Parents who hesitated to punish their children were told they were failing in their spiritual duty. Within the community, such acts were not considered abuse but expressions of love, tools to drive out sin and ensure righteousness. The 12 Tribes community in New Mexico followed these practices with fervent precision. Outsiders who visited saw smiling families and well-behaved children, unaware of the underlying fear that shaped every interaction. The isolation of the compound made it nearly impossible for members to leave or seek help. Communication with the outside world was discouraged, and modern conveniences like television or the internet were forbidden. Those who tried to question or leave were often shunned, cut off from the only family and community they had ever known. One of the movement's defining traits is its intense communal discipline. Members worked without pay, as all income went into a shared fund controlled by the elders. Businesses operated by the group, including restaurants, farms, and construction companies, relied on this unpaid labor. The success of these ventures helped sustain the group financially, but for those within, it meant endless toil. Labor was framed as service to God, and exhaustion was a sign of devotion. The 12 Tribes theology combines Christian fundamentalism with apocalyptic vision. Members believe they are preparing for the return of Yahshua Jesus and that only through total separation from the world can they be saved. The outside world, referred to as Babylon, is seen as evil, corrupt, and doomed. This belief reinforces isolation, keeping members from seeking help or questioning their environment. To leave is to abandon one's eternal purpose, to step into spiritual death. The New Mexico community became emblematic of how the 12 tribes maintained control even across distances. Each commune operated independently but was united under the same doctrines, creating a network of control that spanned the country. Whether in New York, Colorado, or New Mexico, the same language, rituals, and punishments bound members together. The geography might change, but the rules remained absolute. In the early 2000s, reports began surfacing from former members and investigative journalists, detailing the group's hidden practices. Allegations included child labor, physical abuse, and the suppression of individuality. In New Mexico, former residents described an atmosphere where fear and faith were indistinguishable. The compound's leaders used confession rituals to maintain control, requiring members to admit sins publicly. Even minor disobedience, such as speaking out of turn or showing fatigue, was grounds for rebuke. Members were taught to spy on one another, reporting any signs of doubt or disobedience. Over time, these practices eroded individuality until submission became second nature. The deeper one looks into the history of the 12 tribes, the clearer it becomes that geography offers no escape from control. Whether in the green hills of Vermont, the snowbound fields of New York, or the deserts of New Mexico, the structure remained the same. A rigid hierarchy sustained by fear, devotion, and isolation. The communities operated as self-contained worlds, immune to outside influence, yet tightly bound by the same central authority. Today, the New Mexico branch of the 12 tribes still exists. Its businesses operating quietly, its members living apart from mainstream society. Visitors may see friendly faces and hear talk of faith, love, and simplicity. But those who have escaped know what lies beneath the silence of suppressed voices, the scars of punishment, and the weight of unquestioned authority. The story of the 12 tribes New Mexico community is more than a tale of religious extremism. It's a window into how power and belief can twist together to form an unbreakable cage. It shows how devotion, when weaponized, becomes domination, and how communities built on faith can conceal systems of control that destroy the very souls they claim to save. The fields of New Mexico still hold the echo of hymns sung at dawn, the rhythmic sounds of hammers from community workshops, and the whispers of children reciting scripture. But behind those sounds lingers a haunting truth, that even in places of light and devotion, darkness can take root, and that the promise of salvation can sometimes become a prison from which escape feels impossible. The Brotherhood of the Spirit, also known as the Renaissance Community, was a communal group that emerged in Massachusetts during the turbulent 1960s, a time when countercultural movements and alternative lifestyles were flourishing across the United States. The community projected an image of spiritual exploration, free thinking, and self-realization, attracting young idealists eager to escape mainstream society and immerse themselves in a world of art, music, and alternative philosophy. Yet beneath this surface of creativity and rebellion, the group was structured around a strict hierarchy and a culture of intense psychological pressure, which former members would later describe as controlling and punitive. The community was founded by Michael Metellica, who styled himself as a spiritual leader and teacher. Charismatic and persuasive, he drew followers with promises of spiritual awakening and personal transformation. The Brotherhood promoted a blend of New Age philosophy, Eastern spirituality, and radical social ideas, presenting itself as a sanctuary for those seeking to live outside conventional norms. People were encouraged to explore their creative impulses, participate in collective work, and engage in communal rituals, all framed as exercises in spiritual growth and enlightenment. For newcomers, the experience could feel liberating, offering a sense of purpose and belonging in a society that often felt rigid and constraining. Despite the idealistic rhetoric, life within the Brotherhood was tightly controlled. The group operated under a rigid hierarchy, with Metallica at the top and a small inner circle of trusted followers enforcing rules and discipline. Members were expected to conform to the group's ideology, participate in daily tasks and rituals, and adhere to strict codes of behavior. Questioning authority, expressing doubt, or deviating from prescribed norms was not tolerated. Former members recounted a system in which those who challenged leadership or failed to comply with communal expectations faced ostracism, public criticism, or other forms of psychological punishment designed to reinforce conformity and maintain control. The Brotherhood's communal lifestyle reinforced this sense of oversight and dependency. Members lived, worked, and socialized together, creating an environment where the group's ideology permeated every aspect of daily life. Work assignments ranged from farming and construction to art projects, all framed as part of a larger spiritual mission. The community maintained a strict schedule, and personal choices were often scrutinized by peers and leadership. Meals, leisure activities, and even interpersonal relationships were subject to oversight, ensuring that members' lives were inseparable from the group's collective identity. This constant immersion reinforced loyalty to Metallica and the inner circle while limiting exposure to outside perspectives that might challenge the group's authority. Psychological pressure was a central tool of control within the Brotherhood. Members were encouraged to internalize the group's values and ideology, often through intense self-reflection exercises, confessional sessions, or peer critique. This process created an environment in which guilt, shame, and fear of social exclusion were powerful motivators. Former members described a culture where mistakes or disagreements were framed as moral or spiritual failings, leading to a heightened sense of vulnerability and dependence on leadership. By controlling both the social and psychological environment, the Brotherhood was able to enforce compliance without relying on physical coercion, making the group's influence both subtle and pervasive. The Brotherhood also emphasized the rejection of mainstream society, encouraging members to sever ties with family, friends, and institutions that could offer alternative viewpoints. This isolation further entrenched the group's authority, making members increasingly reliant on the community for emotional, social, and spiritual support. While the Brotherhood's teachings were initially framed as liberating, the combination of hierarchical control, communal oversight. For many, the idealistic promises of self-discovery and freedom gradually gave way to experiences of manipulation and coercion. Despite the restrictive environment, the Brotherhood produced a wealth of creative output. Music, art, and theatrical performances were central to the group's identity, and members often poured tremendous energy into collaborative projects. These activities provided both a sense of accomplishment and a means of reinforcing community bonds. Yet even these seemingly positive aspects were closely tied to leadership, with creative expression often evaluated against ideological standards and used to reinforce the group's hierarchy. Achievements were celebrated when they aligned with the community's goals, but dissenting voices or unconventional ideas were quickly suppressed. By the late 1970s, the Brotherhood's strict hierarchy and insular practices began to unravel. Some members left voluntarily, seeking to reclaim independence and distance themselves from the psychological pressures of communal life. Others confronted the leadership with concerns, only to find that the group's mechanisms of control had become deeply entrenched. Retrospective accounts from former members describe both the allure and the danger of the Brotherhood, highlighting how a vision of radical freedom could become a system of strict conformity and manipulation. These testimonies reveal a pattern that would be echoed in other communal movements. The tension between ideals of spiritual or social liberation and the practical realities of centralized authority. Today, the story of the Brotherhood of the Spirit stands as a testament to both the appeal and the hazards of communal life under charismatic leadership. It illustrates how movements that begin with the promise of freedom and self-expression can evolve into systems of control when authority becomes absolute and dissent is punished. The legacy of the Brotherhood is complex. It left behind creative works, life lessons, and a cautionary tale about the delicate balance between idealism and control. For those who lived within it, the experience was transformative, both inspiring and harrowing, leaving enduring memories of a community that promised enlightenment but demanded unquestioning obedience. The Christ Community Church in Florida presents a modern-day example of how spiritual authority can be manipulated to control and exploit followers. At first glance, the church appeared to be a welcoming, faith-driven community, emphasizing devotion, fellowship, and moral guidance. However, beneath its polished exterior, the church operated under a strict hierarchy, demanding extreme obedience, emotional submission, and social isolation from those who joined. The methods employed by the leadership mirrored patterns long observed in historical American cults, demonstrating how charisma and ideology could be used to maintain absolute control over a group of devoted followers. At the center of the Christ Community Church was its senior pastor, a charismatic figure who projected an image of spiritual wisdom, compassion, and moral authority. He attracted a devoted following by positioning himself as a conduit to divine insight, a guide who could provide clarity and purpose in a chaotic world. Followers were drawn by the promise of spiritual fulfillment, community belonging, and a structured moral framework. New members were encouraged to embrace the church's teachings wholeheartedly, participate in daily rituals and services, and commit to the leadership's vision of spiritual obedience. The initial experience often felt uplifting, offering a sense of purpose and a supportive network of like-minded individuals. The leadership's control extended far beyond spiritual instruction. Members were subjected to intense emotional influence, designed to shape their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Emotional control was exercised through practices such as confessional sessions, public critiques, and constant reminders of the pastor's authority. Followers were encouraged to internalize the church's moral and spiritual expectations, with non-compliance framed as both a personal failure and a spiritual deficiency. Fear, guilt, and shame became powerful tools in ensuring obedience. Those who questioned authority, expressed doubts, or resisted directives were often subjected to social isolation or public correction, reinforcing the consequences of disobedience and deepening dependence on the leadership. Community life at the Christ Community Church reinforced this dynamic of control. Members were encouraged or, in some cases, pressured to limit contact with outsiders, including family and friends who might challenge the church's authority. The church organized living arrangements, social events, and work projects that maintained constant involvement in the group, leaving little room for independent thought or private reflection. By creating an insular environment, the leadership effectively monopolized members' social and emotional support, making it difficult for individuals to consider alternatives or escape. For many, the church became their primary and, often only source of identity, companionship, and validation, further entrenching loyalty to the leadership. Financial control was another element of the church's authority. Members were encouraged to contribute tithes, donations, or volunteer labor in the belief that these acts demonstrated spiritual commitment and supported the collective mission. The pastor emphasized that financial and material contributions were a demonstration of faith and obedience, linking personal sacrifice to spiritual reward. For followers already immersed in the emotional and social structure of the church, refusal or resistance carried heavy social and spiritual consequences. The intertwining of financial obligation and spiritual validation reinforced the control the leadership held over members' daily lives and personal decisions. The church's teachings and activities were framed as spiritually necessary, creating a pervasive sense of moral urgency. Religious services, study groups, and counseling sessions emphasized adherence to doctrine, submission to authority, and alignment with the church's communal goals. Even leisure activities, artistic expression, and social interactions were evaluated through the lens of obedience and spiritual correctness. The constant reinforcement of these expectations left little room for questioning or independent thought, ensuring that members internalized the leadership's ideology as a measure of their personal worth and spiritual status. Former members described the experience within the Christ Community Church as simultaneously appealing and suffocating. The initial draw of belonging, purpose, and spiritual guidance gradually gave way to patterns of coercion, fear, and psychological control. Many recounted feeling trapped, unable to reconcile their own thoughts and needs with the strict demands of the community. The church's practices echoed historical examples of manipulative religious groups, where charismatic leaders maintained power by intertwining ideology, emotion, and social structure. Over time, these methods eroded personal autonomy, creating a culture in which obedience was rewarded and dissent punished. Despite its contemporary context, the Christ Community Church illustrates the enduring dynamics of spiritual manipulation. The combination of charismatic leadership, emotional control, social isolation, and financial influence demonstrates how modern religious organizations can replicate patterns long observed in other American cults. The church's story highlights the vulnerability of individuals seeking spiritual fulfillment and the potential for exploitation when authority goes unchecked. It is a stark reminder that the promise of belonging and enlightenment can sometimes conceal coercion, manipulation, and abuse. Today, the legacy of the Christ Community Church serves as a cautionary tale. While the church continues to present itself as a spiritual community, the experiences of former members reveal the psychological and social pressures inherent in its structure. Their testimonies illustrate the subtle ways control can be exerted through obedience, fear, and emotional dependency, and the challenges involved in leaving such an environment. The story of the Christ Community Church is not only a reflection on the dangers of manipulative leadership, but also a broader lesson about the need for vigilance, awareness, and critical thinking in communities that demand absolute submission to authority. The 12 Tribes, a communal religious group with roots in the 1970s, established a branch in Minnesota that exemplified how ideology, strict social control, and psychological pressure can produce deep loyalty and fear among followers. On the surface, the Minnesota community appeared to be a tightly knit group dedicated to spiritual living, hard work, and a return to traditional values. However, closer examination revealed a culture where conformity was enforced. Personal freedoms were limited, and obedience to leadership was not just expected, it was demanded. The branch's existence demonstrated that the dynamics of control could persist across geographic boundaries, replicating the same patterns of compliance and intimidation seen in the group's other American communities. The 12 Tribes' teachings combined elements of Christianity, communal living, and an interpretation of biblical prophecy that emphasized separation from mainstream society. The Minnesota branch adopted these principles fully, creating an environment in which members lived, worked, and worshiped together in close quarters. The community operated farms, businesses, and schools, ensuring that daily life revolved entirely around group activities. Children were educated within the community according to the group's doctrine. Social interaction outside the branch was limited, and any questioning of authority was discouraged. The church hierarchy, mirroring structures from other branches, allowed a small leadership team to exert enormous influence over every aspect of members' lives. Central to the Minnesota branch's operations was a culture of fear and compliance. Leadership reinforced the idea that obedience was not merely a social expectation, but a spiritual imperative. Members were constantly reminded that deviation from prescribed behaviors or beliefs could carry moral, spiritual, or social consequences. Stories of divine punishment, social ostracism, or even familial estrangement were frequently cited as cautionary examples. fostering anxiety and encouraging adherence. This system of reinforcement created an environment in which individuals felt compelled to obey, not merely because of group rules but because of the psychological pressure exerted over daily life. Work within the community was both a spiritual exercise and a mechanism of control. Members were expected to contribute labor to farms, businesses, and communal projects, often under strict supervision and according to rigorous standards. Productivity was framed as an expression of faith, loyalty, and obedience. Failure to meet expectations or questioning directives could lead to criticism, public reprimand, or more subtle forms of social exclusion. Even small mistakes were treated as opportunities to reinforce conformity, ensuring that individuals internalized the community's values and remained attentive to the leadership's expectations. Work was never simply a task. It was a tool of social and spiritual reinforcement. The Minnesota branch also maintained a carefully regulated social structure. Marriage, family dynamics, and personal relationships were subject to the oversight of elders and leadership. Decisions about romantic partnerships or parenting were often guided or dictated by leadership, reinforcing the group's hierarchical system. Children and teenagers, raised almost entirely within the community, were taught strict obedience and a worldview consistent with 12 Tribes ideology. Peer pressure, combined with authority directives, created a feedback loop that strengthened compliance and limited independent thinking. Members internalized the community's norms to such an extent that leaving the group or even questioning its practices felt impossible or morally wrong. Education and religious instruction were another cornerstone of control in the Minnesota branch. Members participated in daily study sessions, sermons, and group discussions that emphasized doctrinal purity and reinforced hierarchical authority. Children were taught the same principles, often with strict oversight, to ensure that lessons were internalized. Any divergence in thought, interpretation, or behavior was treated as a threat to both personal salvation and communal harmony. Through repetitive teaching, ritual practice, and ideological reinforcement, leadership maintained both spiritual and social authority, ensuring that members associated obedience with safety, morality, and divine favor. Accounts from former members of the Minnesota branch reveal a complex mix of devotion and fear. Many describe a profound sense of belonging and purpose within the community, appreciating the structure and shared commitment to faith. At the same time, they recount the psychological weight of constant supervision, the pressure to conform, and the consequences of dissent, even in a state far removed from the group's original base. These dynamics persisted, demonstrating that the mechanisms of control, hierarchical authority, social isolation, work requirements, and spiritual pressure were remarkably resilient. Geography did not diminish the ability of ideology and authority to shape behavior and maintain compliance. The Minnesota branch of the 12 Tribes also illustrates the broader persistence of cult-like dynamics across the United States. By transplanting the group's model to a new state, leaders were able to replicate patterns of obedience, fear, and ideological reinforcement, showing how control mechanisms can endure across time and distance. The community's structure ensured that members remained dependent on leadership for social, emotional, and spiritual guidance, while internalizing the belief that separation from the group was both dangerous and morally wrong. This replication of control underscores the adaptability of such communities and the challenges faced by those who seek to leave or challenge them. Ultimately, the Minnesota branch of the 12 Tribes stands as a compelling example of how persistent ideology, strict hierarchy, and psychological pressure can create compliance and fear, even far from the group's original base. While members often expressed genuine belief and devotion, the underlying mechanisms of control limited freedom, suppressed independent thought, and enforced loyalty through a combination of social, emotional, and spiritual reinforcement. The story of this branch reminds us that the dynamics of influence and manipulation are not confined to any single location. They can travel, replicate, and endure wherever authority and ideology intersect. The New Obian Nation, widely known for its complex teachings and elaborate compounds, established an outreach presence in Florida that mirrored the same patterns of control and manipulation seen in its Arizona and Texas communities. On the surface, the Florida outreach appeared as a spiritual and cultural hub, promising enlightenment, community, and connection to a higher cosmic order. The group's teachings blended elements of African mysticism, Egyptian symbolism, UFO lore, and New Age philosophy, creating a unique, if confusing, spiritual framework. For new members, the message was appealing. Here was a path to knowledge, purpose, and belonging, guided by a charismatic leader who claimed insight into hidden truths of the universe. Yet beneath this facade of spiritual exploration, the Florida outreach exercised extensive control over the lives of its followers. At the heart of the New Obion, Florida outreach was the leadership's insistence on obedience and absolute loyalty. Members were expected to follow a strict hierarchy, with the group's founder, Dwight York, maintaining ultimate authority even from afar. Day-to-day life in the community was carefully monitored, with leadership overseeing work, social interactions, and participation in spiritual exercises. Members' personal freedoms were curtailed. Choices about living arrangements, friendships, and daily routines were dictated by group norms. The leadership framed compliance as a spiritual obligation, insisting that members' devotion and adherence to the teachings were necessary for both personal salvation and the community's well-being. Those who hesitated, questioned, or resisted faced subtle forms of coercion, including social exclusion, public criticism, or ostracism, ensuring that obedience was reinforced at every turn. Financial control was a central tool of influence within the Florida outreach. Members were encouraged to donate money, contribute labor, or invest in group enterprises, often under the guise of supporting the community's spiritual mission. These financial obligations were not optional. Failing to comply was interpreted as a lack of faith or commitment. The intertwining of spiritual authority and material dependence created a cycle in which members felt compelled to give more than they could reasonably afford, believing that their contributions demonstrated loyalty and would secure their spiritual advancement. Former members described leaving the community financially depleted, having surrendered years of earnings to an organization that prioritized leadership enrichment over individual welfare. The Florida outreach also relied heavily on psychological control. Members were immersed in a worldview that presented the outside world as threatening, corrupt, or spiritually deficient. This narrative encouraged isolation from family, friends, and institutions that might offer alternative perspectives. Social and emotional dependence on the group was deliberately cultivated, leaving members vulnerable to manipulation and discouraging independent thought. Daily meetings, study sessions, and communal activities reinforced the group's ideology, blending spiritual instruction with subtle behavioral conditioning. Confessionals, peer monitoring, and public discussions of personal conduct reinforced conformity, creating a climate in which members internalized the leadership's authority as absolute. Life within the Florida outreach was tightly scheduled and highly structured. Work, communal rituals, study sessions, and leisure activities were all arranged to reinforce group identity and adherence to teachings. The community promoted a rigid moral and social code, dictating acceptable behaviors, relationships, and even modes of dress. Deviations from these norms were treated as transgressions against both the community and the divine order, often resulting in punishment or shame. The environment left little space for private reflection, personal autonomy, or independent decision-making, ensuring that the leadership's ideology remained the defining framework for members' lives. The Florida outreach also replicated the broader Nubian emphasis on elaborate symbolism and ritual. The group's compounds, often adorned with Egyptian-style architecture, pyramids, and obelisks, served as constant reminders of spiritual hierarchy and cosmological significance. Rituals and ceremonies reinforced loyalty, spiritual commitment, and collective identity, creating a shared sense of purpose while simultaneously emphasizing members' dependence on leadership. for guidance and approval. Even participation in creative or cultural activities was closely monitored, framed as an extension of spiritual practice, and used to reinforce compliance with the community's teachings. For those who eventually left the Florida outreach, the experience was both liberating and traumatic. Former members described the challenge of disentangling themselves from years of indoctrination, isolation, and control. Many struggled to reclaim autonomy, rebuild relationships, and recover from the financial, emotional, and psychological scars left by the group. The lasting impact of the outreach demonstrates the powerful combination of ideology, charisma, and social pressure, showing how deeply a well-organized and hierarchical group can shape the lives of its followers. The story of the Nuwaubian Nation as Florida outreach illustrates a recurring pattern found in similar communities. A charismatic leader, elaborate teachings, and strict control mechanisms can combine to dominate every aspect of members' lives. Spirituality, art, and culture were employed not only as expressions of belief, but as tools of obedience, financial dependence, and psychological influence. The outreach exemplifies how these dynamics can extend beyond the main compound, replicating control in distant locations while maintaining the same structures of hierarchy and submission. Ultimately, the Florida outreach serves as a cautionary example of how the promise of enlightenment and belonging can conceal coercion and exploitation. While members were drawn by the allure of knowledge, community, and spiritual fulfillment, they were often ensnared by manipulation that limited autonomy, drained resources, and inflicted lasting emotional wounds. The legacy of the Nuwaubian Florida outreach remains a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in high-control spiritual communities and the enduring effects of lives shaped by fear, obedience, and the demands of a charismatic authority. The Children of Thunder, a relatively obscure cult operating in the Midwest United States, left a lasting impression on those unfortunate enough to encounter it. Unlike more publicized groups, the Children of Thunder remained largely hidden from mainstream awareness. Yet its practices were no less extreme. Survivors recount experiences of psychological manipulation, social isolation, and participation in disturbing rituals designed to enforce loyalty and obedience. Though small in numbers, the group's intensity and the control it exerted over members created a climate of fear and dependency that left deep emotional and psychological scars. Founded in the early 1980s by a charismatic leader whose identity remains partially obscured in public records, the Children of Thunder presented themselves as a spiritual community committed to purification, enlightenment, and preparation for an imminent apocalyptic event. Members were often drawn in through promises of belonging, purpose, and access to secret knowledge. Recruitment was subtle yet persuasive, appealing especially to vulnerable individuals seeking guidance, acceptance, or an escape from difficult circumstances. New followers were gradually immersed in the group's ideology, a blend of apocalyptic prophecy, rigid moral codes, and strict social hierarchy. Central to the group's control was the leader's absolute authority. Members were expected to defer to him unquestioningly, believing that his guidance was divinely inspired. Any form of dissent, hesitation, or questioning was framed as a moral failing or spiritual weakness. Reports from former members describe intense scrutiny of behavior, thoughts, and even private emotions. Confessional sessions, both private and public, were a common tool used to monitor compliance and reinforce submission. Those who failed to demonstrate obedience faced punishment, ranging from social ostracism to public humiliation, reinforcing the notion that fear and compliance were inseparable in the community's structure. Rituals were a key component of the Children of Thunder's influence. These were not merely spiritual ceremonies, but instruments of psychological reinforcement. The rituals could involve long periods of isolation, physical endurance exercises, or other forms of stress-inducing practices. According to survivor accounts, participation was mandatory, and refusal was interpreted as disloyalty or spiritual weakness. Through repetition and the creation of a hypersure environment, these rituals bound members together while simultaneously conditioning obedience and compliance. Isolation from the outside world was another tactic employed by the group. The Children of Thunder maintained a secluded network of properties in rural areas of the Midwest, deliberately cut off from mainstream society. Members were discouraged or forbidden from maintaining relationships with family, friends, or anyone who might challenge the group's teachings. Communication with outsiders was closely monitored or limited, reinforcing dependence on the community for emotional support, information, and social identity. By fostering isolation, the leadership ensured that members were more vulnerable to influence and less likely to question the ideology imposed upon them. Daily life in the Children of Thunder was highly structured. Members' routines were dictated by a combination of labor, study, and ritual observance. Work assignments, chores, and communal tasks were framed as spiritual exercises, further blurring the line between obedience and religious devotion. Education for children within the group was controlled, with curricula designed to reinforce loyalty and the apocalyptic worldview. Social interactions were heavily supervised, with peer monitoring playing a key role in maintaining conformity. Any deviation from prescribed behavior risked both social and spiritual consequences, creating an environment where fear was as central as faith. The emotional impact of life within the Children of Thunder was profound. Survivors describe feelings of constant anxiety, guilt, and hypervigilance. The combination of psychological manipulation, isolation, and ritualized control created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Members were trained to doubt themselves and to rely entirely on the leadership for guidance and approval. Even when leaving the group, many former members reported persistent struggles with trust, autonomy, and personal boundaries, demonstrating the long-lasting effects of their experiences. Although the Children of Thunder never achieved the notoriety of other cults, their practices illustrate that danger and abuse can exist in less visible corners of society. The group's combination of extreme rituals, rigid hierarchy, emotional control, and isolation mirrors the patterns observed in more infamous cults, showing that psychological and emotional terror is not limited by fame or media coverage. The stories of survivors reveal both the resilience of those who escape and the devastating impact of manipulation when left unchecked. Ultimately, the Children of Thunder serves as a stark reminder of the power of ideology, authority, and fear. The group's methods demonstrate how a combination of charismatic leadership, social isolation, and ritualized control can dominate lives, distort perceptions, and instill long-lasting trauma. While the Midwest branch of the Children of Thunder remains small, the intensity of its influence on members underscores the potential for harm in even obscure or hidden communities. The experiences of survivors are a testament to both the psychological dangers of such groups and the courage required to break free, reclaim autonomy, and rebuild a sense of self after years of enforced submission. These 25 disturbing cult stories reveal common threads: charismatic leaders, strict hierarchies, emotional and psychological manipulation, and often a detachment from reality that leads to tragedy. From mass suicides to systemic abuse, the United States has seen a broad spectrum of cult activity, each story leaving an imprint of fear, fascination, and caution. As we reflect on these chilling narratives, it becomes clear that the allure of cults lies not only in their promise of community or enlightenment, but also in their ability to manipulate the human mind, exploiting fear, desire, and faith. The dark side of devotion is not a relic of the past. It continues to emerge in new forms, reminding us that vigilance, critical thinking, and awareness are essential in protecting ourselves and our communities. Thank you for joining us on this journey into some of the most disturbing cult stories in American history. If you found this exploration chilling, hit the like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell to join us for more tales from the shadows. Remember, the line between belief and obsession can be terrifyingly thin, and history has shown us the dangers lurking when faith turns into control.